When I was 12 years old, my mother had to go to California for a work conference and decided to take me with her. It was the first time I went with her on one of her trips, and the excitement was palpable. After driving who knows how many miles, we decided to stop at a motel for the night. The place wasn't too bad. Sure, it wasn't a 5-star hotel, but what mattered to us was that there was a comfortable bed to rest for a few hours. Plus, the reviews were positive, and the price was reasonable. During the night, around 2 in the morning, while we were deep in our dreams, we were awakened by a loud knock on the door. My mother went to open it and found the motel owner standing there, telling her that we needed to vacate the room immediately because he had made a mistake with the bookings and had mistakenly assigned it to us when it had actually been booked by another customer who would arrive shortly. My mother, thinking I was asleep, went out of the room to discuss with him. Shortly after, their voices woke me up, and I stayed to listen to what they were saying. After a while, the argument was escalating, so I started to worry. I approached the door and told my mother to forget it and come back into the room. My mother listened to my words, turned, leaving the man at the door, and said, "Hurry, let's pack up and leave." As I was busy packing my things, I heard agitated voices coming from outside. I looked out the window and saw a group of guys starting to argue heatedly with the motel owner. In seconds, the situation became rather tense. My mother, sensing the risk, locked the door. We watched from the window as the guys kept pressuring the owner, saying things like, "Hey buddy, you gotta pay to stay here, you won't get away with it easily." The owner replied firmly, saying he didn't want trouble and would sort everything out. My mother, with a worried expression, turned to me and said, "Stay calm, everything's fine. Keep getting ready." Her voice was calm, but I could sense a slight tension. As I continued to pack my things, the voices from outside became less audible. I looked out the window and saw that the group of guys had left, leaving the motel owner alone at the door. He stood there for a few minutes, thoughtful. Shortly after, he headed towards the reception. At that point, since the situation seemed to be resolved for the moment, we could have stayed there, but we decided to leave anyway. As we exited the motel, I still remember my mother's face. She was frightened, in a panic, even though she tried to mask it. Once inside the car, we quickly drove away from the motel. At one point, I asked my mother, "Mom, what happened out there?" My mother smiled sweetly and said, "It was just some minor trouble between the motel owner and those guys. Nothing to worry about, sweetheart. The important thing is that we're safe." Reassured by her words, I relaxed in the seat and looked out of the window, watching the nighttime landscape slowly passing by. Only now, after many years with the mind of an adult, can I fully understand the seriousness of that night's situation and my mother's ability to handle it in the best possible way. Despite being a single woman with a child, she managed to face the situation calmly and determinedly, protecting me and maintaining my peace of mind. Only now can I fully appreciate the courage and strength she showed that night, and I am grateful to have had such a brave and protective mother. I run a cleaning company that deals with various types of environments, including offices, condominiums, and commercial premises. Usually, I used to do the cleaning in offices at the end of the day. However, one day, I was asked to clean an office earlier than usual because an important meeting was scheduled for the following day, and the office occupants needed it to be clean upon their arrival. That day, I had to go to work at 3 in the morning to ensure that everything was ready by 8 a.m. Arriving at the offices at 3 in the morning, I immediately noticed a van parked not far from the entrance. Unfortunately, it was dark, and I couldn't see if there was anyone inside the van. Initially, I didn't think much of it, but about half an hour later, as I started cleaning the stairs, I noticed from the windows that the van was still there, and that there were 2 men inside holding something. This puzzled me. I immediately began to wonder who had let those men in, considering that the building was located within a fenced area, and to access it, one needed a code to open a large gate. Moreover, given the hour, there was no reason for the van to be there at that time. This raised some concern for me, I decided to continue with my work, but every now and then I would look out from one of the many windows overlooking the building's courtyard to see if the van was still there. Suddenly, around 4 a.m., as I was finishing cleaning the meeting room, I heard noises coming from the floor above me. It sounded like someone was pacing back and forth. This made me nervous. At that hour, I was alone in the building, or at least I thought I was. From the meeting room shortly after, I saw the two men who had been in the van near the elevators. I felt my blood run cold. Both had their faces covered. Given the situation, I decided to immediately call the police. Unfortunately, I realized that I had left my phone in the car. I didn't know what to do. I was in total panic. I decided to gather my courage and look for a working phone in the office. Without attracting the attention of the men, I managed to reach a nearby room where fortunately there was a phone. I immediately called the police, explaining to them what was happening, trying to stay calm and be as clear as possible. The police assured me that there was a patrol in the area and that they were on their way. While hiding in one of the rooms under the table to avoid being seen by the men, I heard the arrival of the police. The men noticed the arrival of the officers and tried to escape. They came down, got into the van, and started to flee. Fortunately, the gate was closed, and a moment later the officers managed to stop and arrest them. Shortly after, another police patrol arrived, took the men, and brought them to the station. The other two officers came to me to ask if everything was okay and to gather information about the situation. I explained to them what had happened and provided all the information to help them in their investigations. In the end, they reassured me that everything was under control and that the men had been arrested, putting an end to that situation. I would never have imagined finding myself involved in such a situation during a work shift. I thanked the officers, and after they left, I took a moment to reflect on how important it was to remain calm and act promptly in such situations. Fortunately, everything was resolved without serious incidents. Our family used to gather every year at Christmas in my grandparents' old country house, but one year, everything changed. Unfortunately, that year, my grandfather Henry had recently passed away, and the task of dismantling the house and preparing it for sale fell upon us. It wasn't an easy task, considering the flood of memories within those walls. For practicality's sake, we decided to stay there for a few days to expedite the process. As we disassembled furniture and packed belongings, the laughter and cheerful voices from past celebrations seemed to echo in the empty hallways. We rediscovered old, yellowed photographs and broken toys from our childhoods. Each item had a story to tell, often immersing us in memories, delaying the dismantling work. After several hours, we were exhausted, so we went to sleep. Around 2 a.m, we started hearing strange noises coming from the basement. We decided to go down to check, but once there, we found nothing unusual. We went back to bed, but after about 15 minutes, we heard the same noises again. So, we decided to go back down to the basement, armed with a flashlight, trying not to panic. The noises seemed to come from a dark and dusty corner, where old furniture, boxes, and a trunk were piled up. Curious about what might be inside that trunk, we began searching for a key. After a few minutes, we found an old rusty bunch of keys in a drawer. With caution, we tried one of the keys, and to our surprise, the lock opened with a slight click. Inside the trunk, there was a black cat with red eyes and dilated pupils. The cat stared at us with a piercing gaze and suddenly lunged at us with sharp claws. Terrified, we jumped back and ran towards the exit of the basement. We barely managed to close the heavy wooden door behind us, barricading ourselves inside the house. The sound of scratching on the wood and the angry meows of the cat echoed in our ears as we tried to catch our breath. We were terrified, unable to understand what had triggered that sudden aggression from the feline. Questions crowded our minds. How had that cat managed to get into our basement? What had made it so aggressive? We decided to immediately contact animal recovery experts, hoping they could help us. As soon as they arrived, we told them about the strange and frightening experience we had lived through and led them to the basement, ready to show them the place where we had encountered the cat. But to our great surprise, when the men descended into the basement, they found no trace of the cat. They examined every corner, inspected every hiding spot, but the mysterious animal seemed to have completely disappeared into thin air. Despite our efforts and the investigations of the professionals, we never managed to explain how the cat had disappeared so mysteriously from the basement. The only way out was the main door that led to the house, yet no one had seen the cat leave. As the days passed, we decided to leave behind that extraordinary experience and focus on clearing the house and preparing it for sale. Even today, the cat in the basement remains an unsolved mystery, leaving questions about how it got there and how it mysteriously vanished into thin air. My childhood friend Daniel and I grew up in a small town nestled among the hills, far from the bustling metropolises. It was a place with around 5,000 inhabitants where everyone knew each other. Over the years, we had heard various rumors about odd occurrences in the area, spooky tales that we thought were mere urban legends. One of these stories spoke of an old, abandoned house in a forest about 7 miles from our town. It was said to have been deserted for about 10 years, with strange presences reportedly wandering the surrounding woods. One day, armed with courage and curiosity, we decided to explore that house. In the afternoon, I went to my friend Danielle's house, where we packed backpacks with sandwiches, dried fruit, and various drinks to tackle the journey without worries. We began to make our way to the house around 2 p.m. After about 5 hours of walking, we finally caught sight of something in the distance. Our legs were weary from exhaustion, and finally, after about half an hour, we reached the house we had heard so much about. There it was, in front of us, nestled in the woods. By now, the sun had set, enveloping the house in darkness. We decided to step inside to explore it and assess whether it would be suitable as a shelter for the night. As soon as we entered, we found ourselves in a medium-sized hall with a large fireplace. With our torches lit, we began to explore every room, searching for clues of its past and the alleged strange events that had occurred there. But unfortunately, we found nothing of the sort. Inside, there were broken furniture, faded photographs, and strange graffiti on the walls. After we had explored the entire house and the situation seemed calm, we decided to establish a base camp in the main hall. We lit a fire to warm ourselves and ate something. While we were eating by the fire, we suddenly heard noises coming from outside, as if someone or something was lurking around the house. We could hear the sound of footsteps on the leaves on the ground. Panic seized us, and we started to look out of the windows to try to understand what it was. Unfortunately, it was dark, and this prevented us from seeing clearly into the distance. Suddenly, in the darkness of the night, we saw a torchlight piercing the darkness from the window. There seemed to be 2 men moving outside the house, but we couldn't see their faces. We tried to block doors and windows with any objects we could find available in the house. We used furniture, wooden planks, and anything else that could prevent access. After some long and agonizing minutes, the 2 men finally moved away. But the fear that they could return at any moment was more alive than ever. We wanted to go back home, but we were afraid that if we tried to leave the house, we might encounter the 2 men wandering in the woods. So we decided to spend the night awake, carefully watching for any suspicious movement or noise. At the first light of dawn, as the sky began to lighten on the horizon, we grabbed our backpacks and set off for home. Every step we took was filled with tension and anxiety, but the determination to return to the safety of our town outweighed any fear. After a few hours of walking, we finally arrived back in our town. We finally felt safe again. Even today, after 4 years, I still wonder who those 2 individuals could have been and what drove them to wander in the woods in the dead of night. "5 years ago, on a night like any other, my house was burglarized. It wasn't just a theft of material items, but a violation of my security and peace of mind. Whoever entered my house that night took away a bicycle, a sofa, a television, some paintings, and even some dollars I had left on the table. After that terrible event, I decided to repurchase everything that had been stolen from me. I chose to buy my bicycle first, as I loved using it for about 30 minutes every morning at dawn. I began searching on Craigslist, which seemed like the most convenient solution at the time. After a few minutes of searching, I found an ad that seemed promising. I contacted the seller to arrange a meeting, and we agreed to meet that same evening. With some difficulty, I arrived at the address indicated by the seller in the ad. I found myself facing an isolated house in the middle of a vast countryside. It was a poorly constructed building, entirely made of wood. Once inside, I immediately noticed an unpleasant atmosphere. There were stains on the carpets, an old torn sofa, and an unpleasant smell. In short, I had just entered and already couldn't wait to leave. The seller, too, looked neglected but seemed like a decent person overall. He welcomed me warmly and led me down to the basement, where he said he had stored the bicycle I was interested in. As I descended the stairs, there were cobwebs everywhere. When we reached the basement, I noticed it was full of many other items covered with protective sheets. Almost instinctively, my gaze landed on them, and I immediately had a strange feeling even though I couldn't see perfectly what was under the sheets. I asked the seller to also take a look at the other items, and he agreed, without hesitation. Once the sheets were removed, I noticed that some items were identical to the ones that had been taken from me. It can't be, I can't believe it, I thought to myself. The same paintings, the same sofa, and on the bicycle was the same sticker I had put on mine. I was incredulous, but I began to piece together the puzzle. There was no longer any doubt. That man had entered my house and stolen all my belongings. With a voice full of emotion and anger, I began to accuse him of being the thief who had violated my home. He remained silent for a moment, not knowing what to say, but then said I couldn't speak to him like that. He became furious and kicked me off his property, threatening to call the police if I didn't leave immediately. Determined not to let it go, I immediately called the police and reported what had happened. Fortunately, the officers arrived at the scene quickly with a search warrant. Meanwhile, as the officers searched the man's house, I returned to my own home to retrieve all the purchase receipts for the stolen items. Once back at the man's house, the officers verified my evidence by checking my purchase receipts with the codes of each product, which unequivocally proved my ownership of the items. At that point, the officers arrested the man and recovered everything that had been stolen from me. That evening, my mind was in turmoil as I reflected on the incredible experience I had just lived through. After that incident, I have changed my perspective on how I consider online purchases. Craigslist, which I once considered a reliable option for doing business, now appears in a different light to me. I have learned from my own experience that behind certain offers, there may be unscrupulous people. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm 41 years old and I live in New York with my wonderful wife Emily and our 2 children, Michael and Jane. Even today, after 15 years, I am still an employee as a computer engineer at a renowned software company. I feel good. It's a stimulating and dynamic environment where I feel appreciated and respected for my skills and dedication. Most of my colleagues are friendly and competent people, with whom I have built friendships and collaborations over the years. Fortunately, with my job, I earn well, which has allowed me to give my wife Emily the opportunity to focus completely on caring for our adorable children. It's wonderful to know that our children are always in good hands. It gives me great peace of mind while I'm at work. For some time, we had the desire to organize a long trip with our children. This time, we felt that the moment had come to unwind and enjoy some relaxation. Emily eagerly wanted to spend time soaking up the sun, while I felt the need to get away from the stress of work and recharge. It was July 9th when we finally started packing for our long road trip. After a few hours, we had everything packed in the car trunk and made sure we didn't forget anything important. We smiled at each other, thinking about the adventures that awaited us as we headed to the car ready to start our incredible travel experience. We preferred not to have a specific destination, but to let the road and destiny guide us. The idea was to plan our itinerary gradually during the trip, leaving room for instinct and adventure. It was a way to fully embrace the spirit of travel and be surprised by the opportunities that would arise along the way. At that point, we started the car engine and set off. The city lights came on as we left New York behind and headed west along the highway. The first 100 miles seemed to fly by under the car wheels, But as the night approached and fatigue began to set in, we decided to make a stop to rest. We stopped at a hotel along the way, and as soon as we arrived, we headed to the reception to check in. The receptionist greeted us with a warm smile and immediately assigned us a room on the 13th floor. Once we were given the keys, we took the elevator up to our floor, curious to discover our refuge for the night. As soon as we entered the room, we noticed that it was spacious and well-furnished, with a breathtaking view of the city stretching out below us. The bed looked inviting, with fresh and soft sheets promising a comfortable night's sleep. We immediately felt at ease, ready to relax and enjoy our stay. After taking a refreshing shower, we relaxed on the bed and started discussing various destinations to visit and experiences to have during the trip. Shortly after, fatigue took over and we fell asleep, almost without realizing it. The next day, we woke up early around 6:30 in the morning. After a hearty breakfast at the hotel, we went to the reception to settle the bill and thank the staff for the pleasant stay. Once the bill was paid, we grabbed our things and left the hotel, ready to resume our journey. As we drove along the roads, we admired the breathtaking landscapes stretching around us, full of vibrant colors and picturesque views. Occasionally, some of them particularly caught our attention, so we would pull over to the side of the road to take some beautiful photos. While I was driving, my children sat in the back seats full of curiosity about everything around us. "Dad, look how big that truck is," exclaimed Michael excitedly, pointing out the window. "Yes, it's really huge. I wonder what it's carrying," I replied with a smile. Jane, sitting behind her mother Emily, began recounting some stories she had heard at school. "Mom, did you know that the other day the teacher told us a story about a dragon that lived in a cave?" "Oh, how interesting. And how was the story? Did you like it?" asked Emily, turning her gaze to our daughter Jane, who nodded with a smile. At some point during the journey, I asked Emily and the children if they felt like stopping for lunch in the next town we would come across. I had heard there was an excellent restaurant with a spectacular view. "That sounds like a fantastic idea. The kids can play for a bit and we can relax," replied Emily with a smile. The children agreed as well, and so, amidst the laughter of the children and the conversations between Emily and me, the journey continued, full of special moments and shared family joy. Shortly after, we arrived at the restaurant. We got out of the car and headed towards the entrance, where we could smell the enticing aroma of freshly prepared food. One of the waiters noticed us and promptly assigned us a table. "This is just what we needed after a few hours of travel," exclaimed Emily, satisfied as she savored the food. Time flew by, and before we knew it, it was around 6 p.m. We had spent 4 hours sitting there chatting while the children played in the restaurant's lawn with other kids. At that point, we were preparing to leave. We warmly bid farewell to the restaurant staff and set off on our journey again, unaware of what awaited us just ahead. As we drove along a deserted road through the countryside, suddenly, I began to hear a strange noise coming from the front of the vehicle. "Emily, do you hear this noise too?" I asked, looking up from the steering wheel with a worried expression. "Yes, it's really strange. Do you think it's coming from the engine?" replied Emily, looking out the window with concerned eyes. The children sitting behind us started asking what was happening. "Dad, why is the car making this noise?" asked Jane, looking at me with curious eyes. "It's okay, sweetheart. Don't worry," I replied, trying to reassure her. In reality, I was the first one to be worried and not knowing what that noise was. With a sigh of uncertainty, I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, the scorching asphalt emanating unbearable heat. We got out of the car, and I approached the hood while Emily and the kids gathered around me with questioning looks. I pulled the lever to open the hood and found myself facing the complex maze of mechanical components that made up the engine. I started trying to identify the source of the noise, but every gear, belt, and pipe seemed to speak a dark and incomprehensible language. But then, I noticed a detail out of place, a loose belt hitting against a metal part of the engine. That was the cause of the annoying noise. A glimmer of hope lit up inside me as I realized there might be a solution to our problem. "Emily, I found the problem," I said excitedly. "It's just a loose belt. Hopefully we can reach the next gas station before it completely gives out." We got back in the car and headed towards the next gas station, which was about 12 miles away. Luckily, after about half an hour, we managed to reach it. My sweaty hands slipped from the steering wheel due to the built-up tension. As soon as we arrived, we realized it was a run-down place, almost forgotten by time. The faded and rusted sign barely swayed in the light breeze of the evening. In the parking lot, several trucks were parked side by side. Presumably, the drivers were sleeping inside. At the end of the parking lot, there was a small motel with a peeling facade and dirty windows. It seemed like the right place for tired and lonely travelers looking for temporary shelter. In short, it was the kind of place I wouldn't have stayed even for a night. Immediately after getting out of the car, telling my wife and kids to wait for me inside, I headed to the gas station's bar to ask for information about any nearby mechanical workshops. The barkeeper, a gruff man with a stern expression, told me there was an excellent mechanic about 20 miles north. I thanked him for the information and left the bar, returning to the car. All we could do now was wait until the next day to fix the car and continue our journey. Unfortunately, I had to eat my words about the motel. That night, it was the only solution we had. We got out of the car, grabbed our suitcases, and headed towards the motel to spend the night. As soon as we crossed the threshold of the motel, we were greeted by an oppressive atmosphere, thick with unpleasant smells. A nauseating mix of alcohol, sweat, and cigarette smoke permeated the air, enveloping us in a suffocating grip. The environment around us seemed to have lost all traces of care or maintenance, with cracked and stained walls and the worn-out floor beneath our feet. The reception was a dark and desolate corner, illuminated only by the faint light of a flickering chandelier. Behind the counter stood a disheveled-looking man, with a dull gaze that seemed to gaze into infinity. Without uttering a word, the man handed us a worn and rusty key, indicating the direction of the room. "Room number 1, he muttered hoarsely. "The room of the sleepless." His tone only added to the discomfort I already felt. Despite the growing unease, we had no alternative. With a knot of tension in my stomach, I took the key, and we headed towards our accommodation for the night. The Insomniac's room. A name that didn't give much hope, it seemed to describe something dark that I sincerely hoped not to discover. Once inside the room, the atmosphere was no better than the rest of the motel. The smell of mustiness filled the air, while the ceiling neon emitted a dim light that conveyed a considerable sense of sadness. The furniture was chipped and worn, showing clear signs of wear and neglect. The bed, with crumpled and stained sheets, seemed to promise more discomfort than rest. The walls were covered in cracked wallpaper that showed signs of age. There was no trace of comfort or welcome in that place, only a suffocating atmosphere that seemed to grip us in an invisible vice. I looked at my wife and children, trying to hide my concern behind a forced smile, saying to them, "Come on, it's just for tonight." After a while, we went to bed in an attempt to get some rest, although it was certainly not easy to find peace in that place. Strangely, after a while, we all fell asleep, tired and worn out from the day's events. However, about 2 hours later, I was awakened by some noises. I woke up abruptly, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. Suddenly, I felt a sense of panic when I realized that my wife and children were no longer in the bed next to me. I began to search frantically throughout the room, checking every corner, but there was no trace of them. I ran out of the room shouting their names at the top of my lungs, hoping they would respond somewhere, but all I heard was the echo of my voice. I rushed to the reception, desperation painting my face as I asked the man behind the counter if he had seen my wife and children. His empty gaze stared at me expressionlessly as he slowly shook his head in denial. I didn't know what to do. My wife and children had disappeared into thin air, leaving no trace. Where could they have gone? Who could be responsible for such a thing? I can't describe in words how I felt at that moment. At that point, gripped by terror and despair, I grabbed the phone and immediately called the police. Fortunately, it wasn't long before a patrol car arrived at the motel. The officers entered the motel room with a determined air, ready to investigate. They asked me a series of questions, trying to reconstruct every detail of what had happened, when I had last seen them, if we had argued, if anything unusual had happened during the day. I answered their questions as accurately as possible. After gathering all the necessary information, the officers headed to the parking lot, searching for clues that could lead them to the truth about the disappearance of my wife and children. They also woke up the truck drivers in the parking lot to ask if they had noticed anything strange, but no one had seen or heard anything unusual. Shortly after, the agents returned to me and informed me that they had gathered all the necessary information for the time being. They told me that they would continue to investigate the matter, but at the moment, there was nothing else they could do. They assured me that if they had any updates or useful information, they would immediately inform me. I returned to my room with a broken heart, unable to find peace and rest. I tossed and turned in bed all night long, feeling guilt and helplessness weighing on me like a boulder. How could I have lost my wife and children like that? The next morning, with a heavy heart from the situation I was facing, I decided to focus on the only thing I could control: the car. Without hesitation, I picked up the phone and called the mechanic, explaining the situation with the belt and telling him I needed the car within 2 hours. The man on the phone assured me he would do his best to fix the belt within that time. I headed to the garage, and as soon as I arrived, he got to work immediately. After about 40 minutes, with a smile, he told me the car was ready. With a deep sense of gratitude, I thanked him, paid for the work, and left. An hour later, I received a call from the police station. With my heart in my throat, I answered, and anxiously listened to the officer's words. He informed me that they had found my wife and children. He said they had been kidnapped by a group of ruthless criminals eager to extort a ransom for their release, and that they were currently held in an old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. A ransom? Absurd. I thought these things only happened in movies, I said aloud to myself as I tried to process the reality of what was happening. I asked the police for the address of the warehouse to go there, but the officer I was speaking to refused to give it to me. He said they would come to pick me up and we would go there together. And so it was. After a few anxious minutes of waiting, I finally saw the police arriving. I got into the squad car, and we immediately headed to the old factory. As soon as we arrived on the scene, we entered the factory, and my heart filled with joy when, from a distance, I saw my wife and children. They were tied up and scared, but fortunately, they were okay. The officers wasted no time and rushed to free them by cutting the ropes. Shortly after, we thanked the officers wholeheartedly for their courage and prompt action, and we left, leaving the old factory behind us. Finally, we were all together again. After a few days, as we were continuing our journey, my phone rang. It was the police station. Without hesitation, I answered. The officer told me that a few hours earlier, they had arrested those ruthless criminals who had kidnapped my wife and children, and we no longer had to worry about them being at large. A wave of relief and gratitude washed over me as I listened to the officer's words on the phone. Justice had been served. Finally, that story was over. Now it was just an experience to forget. My family and I could continue our journey and live our lives in peace. After that ordeal, we learned to appreciate every single moment. We can only be grateful to still be all together, united, and stronger than ever. When my wife, our 3 children, and I decided to move to a peaceful countryside location, we did so with the enthusiasm of embarking on a new phase of our lives. After years spent in the hectic city life, we were eager to find a quieter and more welcoming place to raise our family. The place we moved to seemed to offer everything we were looking for: a relaxed atmosphere, proximity to nature, and a warm and supportive community. To realize this dream, we had to save for several years and wait for the right time in our careers. It was a period of preparation and anticipation, but once everything was arranged, we dove into this new adventure with determination and joy. As soon as we moved, we immediately felt like we had found our corner of paradise, far from the chaos and stress of urban life. We found a cozy house in a family-friendly neighborhood, where neighbors knew each other and helped one another. It was exactly what we were looking for, a place where we could put down roots and feel part of a community. However, our happiness was soon disturbed by a disturbing event. One evening, as I was coming home from work, I found a dog lying on the road, presumably hit by a car and left there. I approached to check if it was still alive, but unfortunately, it was already dead. Once back home, I was devastated, downhearted, and my wife immediately noticed. With a concerned look, she asked if I was okay, so I told her what had happened. She too was very upset and outraged, wondering with what courage whoever hit the animal had left it there on the ground, without even bothering to help. The next morning, I left home to go to work. Fortunately, I no longer thought about the previous day's event. In the afternoon, around 5 p.m., I returned home. I parked the car, and before entering the house, I met my neighbor whom I had never seen before. He welcomed me with a warm and friendly smile. He invited us to dinner at his house that same evening with his family. He seemed like a kind and good-hearted person. He lived with his wife and their 2 daughters. That evening, around 8 p.m., we went to our neighbor's house for dinner, and I brought along a bottle of good wine. As soon as we arrived, I was surprised to discover that the neighbor lived not only with his wife and 2 daughters, but also with a whopping 14 dogs. When he told me, I couldn't believe my ears. He seemed to be an animal lover, and shortly after, he took me to his garage to show me all of his dogs. We stayed there for about an hour as he enthusiastically explained the characteristics of each one. As the neighbor talked to me about his dogs, I couldn't help but tell him about the disturbing event of the previous day that had happened to me. I noticed that his expression suddenly changed. He seemed saddened by what had happened. He asked if I knew who did it, but I replied that unfortunately I had no idea. Meanwhile, my wife started chatting with the neighbor's wife, while my children enjoyed making friends with their kids. At some point, we realized it was almost midnight, and since I had to work the next day, we decided to say goodbye and head back home. We were happy to have met them. They seemed like a really nice family. That night after we returned home, we heard dogs in the distance whimpering. We didn't know what to think. After about 15 minutes, we saw a hooded man coming out of the neighbor's house with a bag in hand, which he threw into the trash can. We began to wonder who it could be since it was dark and we couldn't see his face. We guessed it was the neighbor since he was coming out of his house. About 20 minutes later, we heard the dogs whimpering again. Shortly after, the same man came out again and the scene repeated itself. He came out with another bag that he threw into the trash can. At that point, curiosity overwhelmed me. I waited for the lights in the neighbor's house to go out and for the whole family to go to sleep. As soon as the lights went out, about 15 minutes later, I quietly left the house and approached the trash bin outside their home to see what was in those bags. When I opened one of the bags, my blood ran cold. Inside were 3 lifeless dogs. At that moment, I immediately realized that something was amiss. I went back inside, and when my wife asked if I had found anything, I couldn't speak. After a few minutes, fortunately, I managed to recover from the shock and told her what I had seen. Her face expressed terror. We couldn't believe that those people who seemed so kind and with whom we had dinner could be capable of such a thing. We immediately called the police, who arrived within minutes. We explained what had happened, and shortly after they knocked on the neighbor's door to proceed with inspecting the house. However, they found no incriminating evidence linking the neighbors to those lifeless dogs. As if by magic, the dog bodies were no longer in the trash can. We begged the police officers to believe our story, so they told us that the next evening they would go undercover, without uniforms, in a car parked outside the neighbor's house to catch them in the act. When the police officers left, the neighbor realized that we had called them, and he gave me a threatening look before quickly returning inside. The following evening, around 9 p.m., the police officers positioned themselves in a car not far from the neighbor's house. After about 2 hours, the neighbor came out with a bag that he went to throw away just like the night before. At that moment, the policeman got out of the car and rushed to see what was in that bag. Unfortunately, as expected, inside the bag was a lifeless dog. The neighbor was immediately arrested and charged with animal abuse. All the dogs in the neighbor's garage were taken by the officers and brought to safety. This story has deeply affected me. I will never forget it. The idea that behind the facade of normality and kindness, horrors like this can hide, made me reflect on deceptive appearances and the complexity of human nature. However, I am grateful to have been able to contribute to ending that situation and to have helped those dogs be brought to safety. I hope this experience serves as a warning to remain vigilant and ready to intervene when it comes to protecting defenseless beings. My name is Yasmin, and I am 42 years old. What I am about to tell you happened about a year ago. My husband and I live in a quiet area. He often works at night, so I am forced to spend the night alone. I remember it was a November night, and there was a thunderstorm so strong that the thunder seemed to shake the foundations of the house. Around 2 a.m., I began to hear noises coming from outside, but I attributed everything to the bad weather. After about half an hour, the noises continued, preventing me from sleeping. I got out of bed and headed towards the living room of the house. The noises seemed to be coming from there. Intrigued, I approached the peephole of the door and was stunned to see two men with hoods, dressed completely in black, outside my door. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to understand who they were and what they were doing there. In that pouring rain, I was in total panic. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call my husband because he was working and surely wouldn't answer. I tried to stay clear-headed, but fear paralyzed me. I looked again through the peephole, and to my surprise, those men had disappeared. I checked all the doors and windows of the house to make sure they were closed and locked. I decided to call a friend of mine who lived about a mile away from me. He was a retired police officer. Fortunately, he answered immediately and promised to come to me as soon as possible. In the meantime, he advised me to keep the lights on and stay away from the windows. His reassuring voice on the phone gave me some comfort. While waiting for his arrival, I decided to look again through the peephole of the door, hoping those two men hadn't reappeared. Luckily, there was no one. I breathed a sigh of relief, but I was curious to find out more. Despite knowing I shouldn't, I decided to open the door slightly to take a look outside. As soon as I opened the door, something immediately caught my attention. On the floor, right in front of the door, there was a piece of paper with incomprehensible writing and a lit cigarette. Shortly after, my friend finally arrived and immediately began to explore every corner of the house, but there was no trace of those men. He reassured me by saying that he would inform the station and they would keep an eye on the area for a while. When my husband came home from work the next morning, I told him everything. He was incredulous, but he hugged me tightly, reassuring me that he wouldn't work night shifts for a while so as not to leave me alone at home. His decision lifted a huge weight off my shoulders. We never found out who those men were, but fortunately, that incident has not been repeated. Deep down, I am sure those men had no good intentions. My name is Sandra. I'm a 49-year-old divorced woman with a daughter who lives with me. One morning a few months ago, I had the day off from work and decided to relax on the couch with my computer. I was browsing the internet when suddenly I decided to take a look at Craigslist. Usually when I have free time, I like to explore the various listings, maybe looking at household items or similar things. That day, my eyes fell on the missed connections section, a part of Craigslist where people can post if they've crossed paths with someone in public and maybe had a conversation, but didn't get their name or contact information. Intrigued, I decided to explore that section. As I scrolled through the ads, one in particular caught my attention more than the others. The ad seemed to describe my daughter. Brown-haired girl with an adult woman followed by the name of our city. The text told of casual encounters, as if the person had noticed me and my daughter in various places around the city. It started to scare me. The ad talked about seeing us walking down the street one Tuesday afternoon, and then again the next day at the supermarket where we were both wearing a pink t-shirt. I was unsure whether to respond to the ad to try to understand the intentions of whoever posted it, or to ignore it altogether. Of course, I didn't say anything to my daughter about this to avoid causing her distress. Occasionally, I would check if the ad was still online. That evening, around 8 p.m., like the other times, I went to check if the ad was still online, and I was petrified when I saw that another ad had been posted by the same person, saying they had seen us again in a store selling household items. At that point, it was clear that the person posting those ads was following us. After a while, my daughter noticed that something was bothering me, and I was forced to tell her the truth. Naturally, she panicked and began to be afraid every time she had to leave the house. Given the situation, I decided to contact a friend who worked in the local police. I told him about the situation and asked if he could give me some advice on how to proceed. He reassured me and advised me not to respond to the ad but to gather as much evidence as possible and report it to the authorities. Taking his advice, I took a photo of the ads with my cell phone. Later, I went to the nearest police station and explained the situation to the officer on duty. After listening carefully, the officer assured us that they would do everything possible to identify who had posted those ads. They advised us to be careful, especially when leaving the house in the next few days, and to contact them immediately if we noticed anything suspicious. Back home, we felt somewhat relieved knowing that we had taken the right precautions. About half an hour later, the police contacted us to say that the ad was no longer online. They advised us not to do anything at the moment and to wait, checking if there were any other new ad postings. Fortunately, that story ended and no other ads were posted. We will never know who that man was. Perhaps it was someone who just wanted to scare us and have fun. My name is Harry, and until a few years ago I was a university student living in a small apartment in the city center. My days were very monotonous. I went to class, studied in the afternoon, and occasionally spent some time with a few friends. It was April when a new tenant moved into the apartment next to mine. He was a middle-aged man, a rather quiet and reserved type. A much younger woman lived with him. As time went by, I noticed behaviors that seemed strange to me. He rarely left the house, at most once or twice a week, and when he did, he always seemed in a hurry. Moreover, at night, I often heard strange noises coming from his apartment. It sounded as if he was moving heavy objects. One afternoon, around 3 p.m., while I was at home, I heard screams coming from his apartment. At first, I thought it was just a normal domestic argument, but the yelling continued for about an hour. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a look. I approached the door and listened carefully, trying to understand what was happening. Unfortunately, I couldn't make out what they were saying, but from the tone of their voices, I had the feeling that the situation was about to escalate. I realized I had to do something. I decided to call the police and anxiously waited for them to arrive. Strangely, after my call to the police, the argument between the two ceased. How strange, I thought. They couldn't have heard me talking on the phone. When the police finally arrived about 15 minutes later, they knocked on my neighbor's door, but no one answered. They noticed, however, that the door was open. Once inside, there was no one in the apartment, but what they found left me speechless. The table was covered with various documents and maps with some places highlighted. On the walls, there were hundreds of photos of people who had gone missing in the past 10 years. The police launched an investigation and discovered that my neighbor was wanted for various crimes. 2 days later, fortunately, that man was found and arrested, while the apartment was seized for further investigations. Even though that man was arrested and therefore no longer my neighbor, I decided to move and change my home. That place now made me anxious. After that experience, I learned that appearances can be deceiving, and one must always pay attention to the context around us. What I'm about to tell you happened about 5 years ago. At the time, I was 29 years old, newly married, and living with my wife in a small apartment. She's a strong-willed person, and when we disagree, our discussions can get quite intense. Usually, to restore calm, I prefer to go out for a walk, leaving her alone to cool down. Typically, after a few hours of arguing, we always find a way to clear things up and return to being happy. Except for one time. After a heated argument, she seemed so angry that I feared there was no way out. That time, I really thought my marriage was over. After trying in vain to find a solution to our argument, I felt we needed space to reflect and cool our heated heads. So, without saying a word, I grabbed the car keys and left the house. I drove aimlessly, and after about an hour, I found myself in front of a modest motel on the outskirts of town, about 40 miles from home. Without thinking too much, I went in and got a room for the night. That evening, I really needed some time for myself, to process my thoughts and figure out what I truly wanted from our relationship. I decided to take a shower to try to relax. The hot water flowed over my skin, washing away the built-up tension. It was a brief moment of peace in the midst of the emotional storm I was experiencing. Later, around 9 p.m., I decided to go to a nearby small restaurant for dinner. After about 2 hours, I returned to the motel. Before getting into bed, I took another shower, trying to further release the accumulated tension. Then I got into bed and turned on the TV, waiting for sleep to come. As I was about to fall asleep, I heard noises coming from the door of the room. It sounded like someone was trying to get in. "Who is it?" I yelled, but no one answered and the noises stopped suddenly. Shortly after, overcome by tiredness, I fell asleep. About 40 minutes later, I was awakened by a noise coming from inside the room. In the darkness, I glimpsed a shadow near my bed. I jumped up shouting, and whoever was there immediately ran away. At that point, I decided to go to the reception to explain what had happened. The man running the motel informed me that I wasn't the first to report such a situation. Given the numerous reports from guests, they had reviewed the security camera recordings and discovered that someone had stolen the keys to all the rooms and made copies of them, and that the establishment was waiting for someone to come and replace all the locks. The news irritated me quite a bit. How could they accommodate people knowing that someone outside had access to all the rooms and could do anything at any time? I expressed my dissatisfaction to the man at the reception, emphasizing the seriousness of the situation and the importance of ensuring the safety of their guests. After a heated discussion with the receptionist, he eventually refunded me the cost of the room. But I couldn't let the matter go so easily. I decided to call the police, who arrived on the scene after about 20 minutes. They asked me detailed questions about my stay at the motel and the series of events I had experienced that evening. Shortly after, I felt the need to contact my wife to see if she had calmed down. I called her and quickly explained the situation. Fortunately, she had calmed down, and when she heard what had happened, she said, "Come on, come back home now. Don't make me worry." I returned to the police officers to tell them that I was about to leave the motel and that if they needed anything, they could contact me. So I went back to the room, packed my things, got in the car, and headed home. The feeling of getting away from that motel gave me a sense of relief. The only thing I wanted at that moment was to see my wife. Once back home, my wife greeted me with a tight hug. At that moment, I realized that our union was stronger than any challenge we might encounter, and with that awareness, I surrendered to the sweetness of returning to normalcy, knowing that together, we would face whatever life threw at us. I had always considered air travel as a sort of personal challenge, an experience to be faced only on special occasions. My life was marked by only 5 flights, all 5 for vacations between South America and Africa. I've always been an anxious type, so the only way to deal with them was with a good dose of tranquilizers in my bloodstream, indispensable allies to overcome the anxiety that pervaded me at the mere thought of boarding a plane. Air travel wasn't the only stressful time in my life. During my college years, I studied at a college about 1,500 miles away from home. Trips back home involved long car journeys to reach family, with nights spent in various motels scattered along the interstate. I still remember those long stretches of road, the monotonous noise of the tires on the asphalt, and the loneliness of the night, broken only by the reflection of passing truck lights. Once, during one of these trips, I witnessed a scene that made me shudder. I had been driving for several hours and fatigue was starting to set in. So, I decided to stop at a motel along the way. I had never been there before, but it was the only one for the next 200 miles. As soon as I arrived at that motel, there was a man behind the reception desk. Without wasting time, I paid for the night and retrieved the key to my room. I was heading towards my room when I noticed a car parked. An elderly man, about 70 years old, was searching for something in his car. An instant later, a car pulled into the motel parking lot, from which 3 men emerged and immediately approached the man who was still intent on his search. The scene seemed harmless, but something told me that something was about to happen. In the meantime, I entered my room and watched them from the window as the situation unfolded before my eyes. What happened left me speechless. The 3 men, for some reason, had a key to that man's room and forcibly coerced him to enter his room. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to intervene. I wanted to do something, but I was afraid. afraid of making the situation worse. I felt a tangle of emotions tormenting my mind. I wanted to call the police, but the fear of misunderstanding the situation paralyzed me. The idea of meddling in other people's affairs, of looking foolish, or of putting myself in danger, paralyzed me. After anxiously waiting for about 15 long minutes, during which the men remained inside the room with the man, I decided to act. I felt I had to do something to help that elderly man, even though I wasn't sure what the best course of action was. With my heart in my throat, I headed towards the motel reception. My mind was a storm of thoughts and worries. How could I explain the situation to the receptionist? What if he didn't believe me? What if my interference only made things worse, but the urgency of doing something outweighed any doubt and fear? I had to at least try to ask for help, to let someone know that something was happening at that motel. When I reached the reception, the man running the motel had fallen asleep behind the counter. With a mixture of impatience and anxiety, I gently woke him up and explained the situation in a breathless voice. I told him that there were men who had forcibly coerced another guest into his room and that I was afraid he might be in danger. The receptionist seemed skeptical, almost indifferent to my words. Despite my efforts to be clear and convincing, he looked at me with a bored air and barely shook his head. "Don't bother," he said with an annoyed tone. "Let them sort it out among themselves," he said with a smirk. At that point, given the receptionist's indifference, as I walked away from the motel reception, I began to think that he might be involved with the 3 men who had forcibly coerced the man into his room. At that moment, it was the only explanation I could give myself. As I returned to my room, I noticed that the men were still inside the man's room. Suddenly, as I watched what was happening, I saw the 3 men forcibly take the man again, drag him out of the motel, and then force him into their car. An instant later, the car drove away from the motel. The temptation to enter the men's room to search for evidence that could help me understand the situation overwhelmed me, but at the same time, the idea of meddling further and putting myself in danger held me back. At that point, driven by a sense of responsibility and the desire to do the right thing, I decided to immediately call the police. I told them all the details, explaining that there had been a kidnapping. The officers promptly arrived at the motel and conducted a search of the elderly man's room. They found nothing strange except for a note on one of the nightstands with an address written on it. This address led to an old warehouse. The investigations, as I suspected, later revealed that the receptionist was involved in the matter, as he turned out to be the owner of the warehouse where they held the old man captive. In the end, fortunately, the receptionist and the 3 men were arrested. It was discovered that the reason behind the kidnapping was a matter of personal revenge against the elderly man for issues related to the past. Even today, 7 years later, I have not forgotten this incident. This experience taught me that it is essential to act when we see someone in distress, because only by joining forces and collaborating can we build a safer and fairer world for everyone. Of course, I hope I never experience anything like this again. I had moved into my new apartment for about 2 weeks and was in search of an affordable kitchen table and 4 chairs. I decided to do a quick search on Craigslist, hoping to find something that would suit my needs. After examining several listings, I finally found what seemed to be a good deal: a solid wood table and 4 chairs for only $100. The photos showed a table in excellent condition, perfect for my small space. I immediately contacted the seller, a certain John, who confirmed that both the table and chairs were still available. He told me he was making space for new furniture and wanted to get rid of the table and chairs as soon as possible. We decided to meet at his apartment that evening around 8 p.m. Upon arrival, I found myself in a rundown area, surrounded by old buildings and a neglected environment. It was evident that it was not a safe area. As I entered the building, I immediately noticed it was in terrible condition: broken walls, mold everywhere, and a general sense of neglect. Additionally, there was no elevator, and I had to climb the stairs up to the 5th floor. As I climbed the stairs, I wondered how I would manage to transport a table and 4 chairs to the ground floor without an elevator. When I reached the apartment door, I rang the doorbell, and a moment later, A man around 60 years old opened it. He looked unkempt, wearing a stained shirt and quite dated pants. A disgusting smell emanated from inside the house. Despite the initial negative impression, I decided to gather my courage, quickly retrieve the items from the listing, and leave. Once inside the apartment, I asked John where the table and chairs were, as the house seemed to be empty. Suddenly, 3 armed men, with their faces covered by hoods, entered the house. One of them began shouting in a language I couldn't understand. "Don't move," John said. He said, "Don't move." I immediately raised my hands in surrender while John seemed completely indifferent to the situation. I couldn't understand how he could be so calm. One of the men approached me menacingly, demanding that I hand over everything I possessed. With an aggressive tone, he ordered me to give him my phone, bag, and any other valuable items I had with me. His voice paralyzed me, filled with intimidation, as he forced me to hand over my personal belongings. Suddenly, I saw John speaking with one of those men as if they had known each other for a long time. In that moment, I understood everything. They were in agreement. They were accomplices. There were neither table nor chairs in that house. The listing was simply a bait. I had been deceived. Once the robbers retrieved everything they wanted, they ran away. Shortly after, John followed them. Before leaving the door, he turned and said to me, "I'm sorry, sweetheart." I stood there for a few minutes in a state of shock. Not knowing what to do, I called the police and told them about my experience. Soon after, 2 officers arrived. As I listened to their conversation, I realized that a similar situation to mine had already occurred in that area for the 4th time in just 1 month. The officers told me that John was part of an organized gang that used online listings to commit robberies. Although he was caught and prosecuted, the trauma I experienced remains indelible. Even today, I feel foolish and naive for believing I could get such a good deal on Craigslist. I should have realized there was something off, although I never imagined I could end up in a situation like this. The whole experience has left me with a sense of vulnerability and paranoia that I struggle to overcome. My name is Jake and I am 11 years old. I've always hated school and almost every morning I didn't want to go. Consistently, I always ended up arguing with my parents, trying in every way to avoid facing that boring day of lessons. One morning my parents, as often happened, had to leave for 3 days for work, and so they didn't have time to argue with me. My mother, when she had to leave for work with my father, was always worried about leaving me alone. I didn't mind at all. In fact, I liked being alone. Every time she suggested leaving me with one of her friends who had a son my age, but I refused. I absolutely didn't want to go. I preferred to stay at home, play PlayStation, watch TV on the couch, and enjoy my free time. That morning, while my parents hurried to get ready to leave, I was sitting in the living room, reluctant to see them go. It was as if a part of me wished they would stay. I don't know why. It had never happened to me before. But when they left the house with their suitcases after about half an hour, I didn't think about it anymore. I thought about the fact that I would be alone at home for 3 whole days, without having to worry about going to school or being forced to do something I didn't want to do. At that point, I decided to have a hearty breakfast, eating cereal with lots of milk and chocolate. I spent the rest of the afternoon drawing, which was my true passion. I took my papers and my favorite colors and let myself be carried away by creativity. That day, time flew by quickly. It was already evening, and I decided to make myself a simple sandwich with ham and cheese. After dinner, I sat on the couch to play PlayStation for a few hours. Suddenly, I heard a slight noise coming from the front door. I jumped up and approached the front door asking, "Who is it?" But no one answered. I returned to the couch thinking it was just the wind or some random noise. Shortly after, however, there was another knock on the door. This time, I approached more slowly, trying to hear if there was anyone on the other side. Once again, silence. At that point, I asked again, "Who's there?" No one answered. I was a little scared, but I decided to open the door. When I did, there was no one there, just darkness outside. I closed the door quickly and returned to the couch. Shortly after, a series of knocks on the door made me jump. I was confused and scared. My mind was in turmoil. Who could it be? Maybe a prank? I decided to approach the door again. "Who's there?" I asked firmly, trying not to show the fear I felt inside. A man on the other side of the door replied that he needed help. At that point, with some fear, I decided to open the door. I found myself facing a man who looked unkempt, saying he needed to make an urgent phone call because his phone was dead and his vehicle was broken down along the road. It seemed strange to me. He didn't seem to have good intentions. I didn't like his gaze. I immediately asked him if he had been the one knocking on the door before. He said no. Shortly after, he asked me again to make a phone call. I was scared, but I couldn't say no, so I let him in. Once inside, the man began to make strange movements, waving his hands nervously and looking at me strangely. He started asking me strange questions about my parents, as if he wanted to understand when they would be back home. I tried to stay calm. I showed the man where the phone was to make his call. He headed towards it, dialed a number, and started talking to someone, telling them about the broken-down car and other things. I couldn't hear any voice on the other end of the line. It all seemed fake, as if he was just acting. Shortly after, the man asked me where my parents' bedroom was. I didn't like it at all. With a knot in my stomach, I told him it was upstairs. He assured me he would be back soon and headed towards my parents' bedroom. Taking advantage of the fact that he was upstairs, I decided to call the police to report what was happening. I didn't like the turn that situation was taking at all. An officer on the phone immediately reassured me, telling me not to worry and to stay calm, assuring me that units would intervene quickly on the scene. In fact, after a few minutes, I saw the flashing lights of the police cars outside the window. Without wasting time, I showed the officers where the man was. As soon as they went upstairs, they found him trying to steal some valuable items that my mother kept in a dresser in the bedroom. With a sigh of relief, I saw the officers immobilize him and take him away in handcuffs. I felt safe. One of the officers informed my parents of what had happened, explaining to them what had happened and reassuring them that everything was under control. My parents, worried, decided to come home earlier than planned to make sure I was okay. They were relieved to see me safe. Even today, I thank my younger self for having the quick thinking to call the police. That man could have done anything. Luckily, everything turned out for the best. My name is Lucas. I'm from Brazil, and tennis has always been my greatest passion. Since I was young, I've spent hours and hours on tennis courts, honing my skills and enjoying every moment of play. There's nothing that makes me feel more alive and free than hitting the ball with my racket, feeling its bounce on the court, and running towards it with determination. I've always dreamed of gracing the courts of Wimbledon or winning a Grand Slam. But as the years passed and the inevitable responsibilities of adult life set in, that dream seemed increasingly out of reach. Unfortunately, work and daily commitments began to take precedence over my passion. Over time, I accepted that perhaps that dream was not meant to come true and decided to find a stable job to ensure financial stability. Currently, I live alone in an apartment in the heart of the city. One day I was off from work and at home. As I was lost in my thoughts, the phone rang. It was an old childhood friend, one of the companions with whom I spent whole days playing on the courts. His voice was impatient, full of enthusiasm. He offered me a job at a prestigious tennis club located in a city 300 miles away from mine. I couldn't believe it. At that moment, my heart began to beat fast. I remember it was an indescribable emotion. Perhaps finally destiny was opening a window to my dream. I didn't hesitate for a moment. Taking advantage of the fact that I had no family ties or other commitments holding me back, I immediately accepted the opportunity. That same day, I began to pack my things frantically, encountering some memories as I packed my personal belongings into boxes for the move. I looked around the apartment that I loved so much, aware that I was about to leave behind an important chapter of my life. But the excitement of what awaited me was too strong to allow myself to dwell on feelings of nostalgia. With my heart full of joy and hope for the future, the next day, in the afternoon, I loaded my car with all my belongings, closed the door of the apartment for the last time, and left. After a few hours of driving, I decided to stop at a motel along the way to rest and continue the journey the next day. I never would have imagined that night would be anything but restful. After parking the car, I headed to the reception to inquire about room availability. Fortunately, that evening, all the rooms were vacant, except one. Once I got the keys, I headed towards the room assigned to me. It was number 7. As soon as I entered, I noticed that the room was quite dated, neglected, but it didn't matter. My happiness at that moment was too great to be disturbed by such insignificant details. After about half an hour, I lay down on the bed trying to fall asleep. Shortly after, I began to hear noises coming from the next room. Initially, they were just barely perceptible whispers, but then gradually they began to intensify. I tossed and turned in bed for about an hour, trying to ignore them, but with little success. Those weren't just random noises, but sounds that evoked overwhelming passion. I could hear the voices, the muffled laughter, the subdued moans. It was clear that a man and a woman were sharing a moment of intimacy and passion in the room next to mine. I couldn't help but be disturbed by the situation. I felt like my peace was being violated. It began to bother me. At one point, I pounded on the wall forcefully, hoping to make them stop, and for a brief moment it seemed to work. Unfortunately, the quiet lasted very little. Those sounds, if we can call them that, resumed with even more intensity. I started pounding on the wall again, but the two in the next room didn't seem to stop. The passion of the two strangers continued to echo in my head, making any attempt at rest impossible. Frustrated and tired, I desperately tried to find a comfortable position in bed, hoping that sleep would take me in a merciful embrace. However, every movement of my body was accompanied by that annoying background noise that seemed endless. In the end, I managed to rest only a bit towards dawn, when the two in the next room probably fell asleep exhausted, or at least so I thought. In the morning, I was awakened by a knock on the door. I immediately got out of bed, and with my heart in my throat, I headed towards the door. As soon as I opened it, I found myself facing 2 police officers with serious and focused faces. A shiver ran down my spine. One of the officers stared at me in the eyes without saying anything. I couldn't understand what was happening. I remained silent for a few seconds when suddenly he said, "Did you hear anything suspicious last night?" Meanwhile, the other officer scrutinized my expression carefully, looking for any signs of nervousness or uncertainty. With a dismayed expression, I nodded in agreement, confirming that I had heard sounds and noises coming from the next room. I was agitated. My mind began to race frantically, thinking of the worst. As the officers took note of my words carefully, I suddenly felt involved in a situation that went far beyond my quiet, interrupted night. When they opened the door to the next room, they found no one inside. Neither the man nor the woman were present, immediately drawing the attention of the officers. The two had left without saying anything, taking the keys to the room with them and leaving their documents at the reception without picking them up. Inside the room, on the desk, they found a camera. The officers, curious, decided to examine it. The recordings inside revealed the entire night of passion between the two. It turned out that the two were ex-lovers who were trying to rekindle their relationship. As the officers continued their investigation, it emerged that the man turned out not to be a reliable individual. On the contrary, he had been involved in some legal troubles in the past, further fueling concerns about the safety and well-being of the woman. Even today, the two have not been found. Who knows where in the world they are now and what reasons led them to leave the motel in that way without giving any explanation. Despite the time that has passed, their disappearance continues to raise questions and hypotheses. I grew up in a small town in the rural county of Texas, where my parents ran a ranch. Our modest house was located on the outskirts of town, surrounded by prairies and wheat fields. When I wasn't at school, I spent my days playing with my friends and sometimes helping my father take care of the animals. One of my father's closest friends, Mike, lived nearby. He was a sturdy man with a long white beard and a booming laugh. Despite his somewhat rough appearance, he was always kind to me and my family. One day, while I was home alone after school, there was a knock on the door. I looked out the window and saw Mike on the doorstep. It seemed odd to me since he never came when my father wasn't home. Despite my uncertainty, I decided to open the door. "Hey, kid," Mike said in a gravelly voice. "Everything okay?" I immediately sensed something strange in Mike's demeanor. "Yeah, Mike, everything's fine," I replied. "What do you need?" His eyes seemed to scan the inside of the house as if searching for something. "Oh, nothing special," he said. "Your father told me to come here to fix a door lock." I thought my father had forgotten to tell me, so I said, "Sure, Mike, come on in." As soon as he entered, he headed towards the door to be fixed, and after a few minutes of being there, he said, "Kid, come here. I want to show you something interesting if you're up for it." I sensed he had ulterior motives, but didn't want to appear rude. "Thanks, Mike," I said, "but I can't right now. Maybe later." His expression darkened, and he approached slightly. "So, you're really going to refuse me?" he said with a forced smile. I felt a shiver of discomfort, but trying to stay calm, I replied, "I'm sorry, Mike, but I have things to do now. I need to finish my homework." His expression suddenly turned into a mask of anger. "Fine," he said, clenching his fist, "but you'll regret it." At that point, he walked away towards the exit. When he left, I noticed that the lock hadn't been fixed, so I realized he had lied about it being broken. I had confirmation that he had come because he had something in mind. When my parents came home, I told them what had happened. My father was angrier than I had ever seen him before. He took me by the hand and said, "Come with me." We headed towards Mike's house, and once there, my father grabbed him by the shirt and with a stern look told him to stay away from me. He told him that if he dared to approach me again, there would be serious consequences. His voice was full of authority and determination, making it clear to Mike that if he approached me again, it would end badly. After that incident, I was afraid to stay there. I couldn't sleep at night anymore, and I began to suffer from anxiety attacks. My mother was frightened too. At that point, for the well-being of the family, my father decided to move. So a month later, we were in another house. I felt better, and the family regained peace. Even today, occasionally, I think about that episode, and every time a shiver runs down my spine. Fortunately, I never saw Mike again. It was 1997, and my family had decided to embark on a journey along the roads of Oregon. It was me, my father, my mother, and my two sisters. By evening, we were all quite tired and decided to stop for the night at a small motel along Route 101. It was an old building with a rusty tin roof and windows covered in dust. Despite its neglected appearance, we decided to give the place a chance, drawn to the allure of the mystery that seemed to surround it. My father approached the reception, where an elderly gentleman with a mysterious look assigned us a room. We paid the $19 required for one night and headed towards our accommodation. The room we found ourselves in was dark and gloomy, with old furniture and a disgusting smell of mold in the air. On a dresser sat an old 80s television. I tried to turn it on, hoping it would distract us from the discomfort, but the reception was poor and the sound didn't work. Around 11 p.m., while we were all trying to fall asleep, we suddenly heard the door handle move. A shiver ran down our spines as the faint sound of the lock being manipulated sent chills down our veins. My father got up from the bed, his eyes fixed on the door, ready to confront whoever might be about to enter at any moment. Whoever was on the other side seemed unable to get in. My father approached the door and began to pound on it with his fists, while with a firm and authoritative voice he shouted for them to leave. Suddenly, whoever was on the other side stopped trying to open the door. The tension hung thick in the air as we waited, holding our breath, to see if the intruder had gone away for good or would resume trying to open the door. We looked at each other, fear in our eyes. My mother gathered her courage and approached the window to take a look outside, but the darkness was so dense that she couldn't see anything. After about 10 minutes, we decided to go back to bed. My father made sure all the doors and windows were securely locked and turned on a small nightlight he had in his suitcase. The night passed quietly, although due to the agitation, we didn't sleep very well. The next morning, my father went to the reception to tell them what had happened and seek explanations for the strange episode of the previous night. He approached the counter, looking around to find the elderly gentleman who had assigned us the room, but the reception was empty. There was no one in sight, neither customers nor motel staff. With some perplexity, he called out several times, but no one answered. It almost seemed like the motel had been abandoned overnight. At that point, he decided to leave the keys on the counter and leave that place as soon as possible. To this day, we are unaware of who the person was who tried to enter our room that night and what their intentions were. Over time, this story has become an anecdote that we tell to friends and relatives. My name is Alex, and what I'm about to tell you is truly incredible. I grew up in a family where both my parents were doctors. We were happy, we lacked nothing, we had a beautiful house, went on several trips during the year, and everything seemed normal, or at least that's what I thought. For some time now, every 2 weeks, 3 black vans, accompanied by a car of the same color, inexorably parked in front of our home. Some men with imposing appearances, dressed in black and with stern faces, moved with military precision, unloading heavy boxes directly into my father's garage. That garage had become a forbidden place for me since childhood. My father absolutely did not allow me to approach. Yet, as I grew up, the desire to discover what was inside grew more and more. As time went on, curiosity turned into an obsession. Every time those vans and that car made their mysterious visit, I felt drawn to the enigma that seemed to envelop our family. None of my parents bothered to explain what was really happening, nor what those packages, transported with such care, contained. Every time I asked them what was inside those large boxes, my parents responded with the same enigmatic phrase: "One day when you are old enough, you will understand. And if you want, you can join the team." Then they would smile, as if hiding behind those complacent smiles a truth too big to be revealed to a child of my age. One day my father was out with my mother, and taking advantage of the fact that they wouldn't be back until evening, I decided to take the key to the garage to find out what was inside. As soon as I opened the door and turned on the light, I was breathless at the scene that unfolded before my eyes. In the center of the room was an operating table, while along the walls of the garage were several refrigerators, neatly lined up like soldiers awaiting instructions. In addition to the refrigerators, there were several perfectly clean steel tables and various medical equipment, some of which seemed to come from a remote era. I didn't understand immediately. Why did my father insist on keeping that place hidden from me? This question began to whirl in my mind as I puzzled over the contents of the garage. Suddenly, I heard the sound of my parents' car returning earlier than expected. I started to panic, terrified at the thought of being discovered inside. I quickly closed the garage, hurried back inside, and put the key back in its place. I wasn't satisfied. I needed to understand more. I decided I had to find out what my father was hiding once and for all. I had noticed that often the 3 vans along with the car arrived on Tuesdays. So, the following Tuesday, I told my parents that I needed to go to a friend's house to do some math homework so that I could hide in the garage to understand what happened when those large packages were delivered. As expected, around 6:00 p.m., the 3 vans and the car arrived. As the men brought the boxes into the garage, I was hiding behind one of the refrigerators that was slightly moved away from the wall. What I discovered petrified me. Suddenly, I didn't feel my body anymore. My parents began to examine the packages. Inside were 6 young adults, no older than 30, lifeless. I was shocked. Hearing their conversations, I understood that my parents were involved in organ trafficking. After what I had seen, I couldn't look at my parents the same way anymore. I was almost afraid to stay in the same house with them, even though I knew they would never harm me. I was disappointed. I looked at them with different eyes. I wanted to delve deeper into the matter. Once again, it wasn't enough for me. I decided to investigate the men in the vans and the one in the car. The next time they arrived, strangely on a Thursday, I hid behind a car and watched them. They were serious men, expressionless, almost intimidating. I noted down the license plate numbers of the 3 vans in the car. After various searches, I found out that one of those vans in the car were registered to my father, while the other 2 vans belonged to my mother. I didn't know what to do or what to think. The discovery I made was an unbearable weight on my shoulders. I felt as if I had discovered a world completely different from what I knew, a world of darkness and unspeakable secrets. At that point, I decided to confront my parents. I knew it was risky, but I had to do it. So after 2 weeks, when they unloaded those packages again, I ran into the garage and hid behind the refrigerator like the previous time. As soon as my parents arrived and started opening the packages, I came out and said, "What are you doing?" Their faces were incredulous and terrified to see me there. "What is all this? Please explain to me?" They looked at me without speaking. They were petrified. They didn't know what to say. They started to explain to me that it wasn't as it seemed, that they didn't harm anyone, and that those people unfortunately had already passed away in the hospital or elsewhere, and their task was to retrieve organs to donate to those in need. Then, they revealed to me that for some time now, unfortunately, they had financial problems, but they hadn't confessed it to me to avoid worrying me. They added that, therefore, to cope with the financial difficulties of that period, they had been forced to do that kind of work to supplement their income. Honestly, even though I was just a child, I didn't completely believe their words. I didn't know what to do, whether to go to the police or not. On the one hand, I felt it was the right thing to do. On the other hand, I didn't know to what extent what my parents had told me was true. In the end, they were my parents and I loved them, so I decided not to report them. Several years have passed since then. I have grown up, and I still don't know if there was anything illegal in that situation. I preferred not to investigate. About 4 years ago, I experienced the strangest event that had ever happened to me. I had recently moved into my new house located in a quiet neighborhood. The apartment was cozy but still quite bare, so I was on the lookout for interesting items to furnish it. I wasn't an expert in interior decoration, but I was determined to make my home more inviting. I decided to search on Craigslist, hoping to find some deals that would suit me. Soon after, I found an interesting ad. A woman was selling various furniture items at a great price, so I decided to contact her immediately, and we agreed on a meeting later that afternoon. I headed to the neighborhood where she lived, an area far from the city center, surrounded by trees and houses with gardens. I parked my car and knocked on the door. I was greeted by an elderly woman with a warm smile, with whom I chatted for a bit before entering. Her house was cozy, with a driveway lined with colorful flowers. She led me into a large room where the items I had seen in the ad were displayed. I started to take a look at the various items, and they seemed really interesting, perfect for my home. The woman asked me why I was so interested in her ad, and I explained that I had recently moved and wanted to make my new place cozy without spending too much. Intrigued, I asked her why she was selling all those items at such a low price. She said she was trying to get rid of the old to make room for new energies in her life. It seemed like a valid motivation, but the way she looked at me while saying it caused me an uneasy feeling. As we talked, I noticed a strange demeanor in her movements. I didn't want to seem rude, but I began to sense that something was off. So I started to pick up the various items to load them into my car. Shortly after, while I was outside loading the items into my car, the woman's husband arrived. He looked at me sternly and exclaimed, "What are you doing, young man? Bring these items back into the house immediately." Then, addressing his wife angrily, he exclaimed, "What were you thinking? Have you completely lost your mind?" The man seemed completely beside himself, furious, while his wife began to cry desperately. To avoid trouble, I decided to bring the items back into the house. The husband, addressing me and his wife, said that we would have to pay for what we had done. I thought that man was crazy. He started staring at me, breathing heavily, making me shudder. I told him to calm down, that I had no intention of taking his items, and that I would leave his house immediately. At that point, I quickly walked to my car and left that place in a hurry. I was convinced that man was crazy, that he had some kind of problem. The next day, out of curiosity, I decided to go back to that place. Looking through the windows, I noticed that the house was completely empty. I was speechless. In less than 24 hours, the house had been completely emptied, and there was no trace of that man and his wife. It almost seemed as if they had fled from something. After that experience, I decided not to use Craigslist anymore. At least for now, I prefer to avoid it until I forget about this bad experience I had. It was a summer night like any other, and as I walked with my friend Brian along a suburban street, I felt a strange sensation. Brian also noticed immediately that something was wrong from my expression. He saw that I suddenly turned pale and my pupils dilated. For some reason, I began to feel as if I was being watched. We continued walking, and soon we noticed an old abandoned house near a dense forest. Despite a voice inside me telling me to keep walking, curiosity got the better of me. We decided to approach and take a look inside. As we approached, I felt that strange sensation again, as if someone or something was warning me to stay away from that place. It was around midnight, and the wind whispered through the trees, making the atmosphere even more eerie. Armed with flashlights and courage, we ventured into the house. As soon as we entered, we found ourselves in a large room with some furniture in terrible condition, peeling walls, and dust everywhere. It was clear that no one had set foot in that place for a long time. Every step echoed in the emptiness as we explored the surroundings. On the ground floor, there were only 4 rooms. We decided to explore them, but found nothing particularly interesting inside. They were just empty rooms with some faded documents on the floor. However, the strange feeling of being watched didn't leave me. In fact, it seemed to intensify when we reached a staircase leading to the upper floor. Brian and I locked eyes, unsure whether to go up or not, but we decided to gather our courage and continue our exploration. Once upstairs, we found ourselves in a dark and silent hallway. Our flashlights barely illuminated the darkness, revealing only traces of mold on the walls and shaky floors beneath our feet. We continued to advance cautiously, scrutinizing every corner for clues about what might be hidden in that place, forgotten by time. At one point, a partially closed door caught our attention. It was almost as if it was inviting us to enter. That was the feeling I had. With our hearts pounding, we approached slowly, fearing what we might find beyond that threshold. With a deep breath, we pushed the door open slowly and entered. The room was illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through an old window covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center, there was an old wooden table surrounded by dilapidated chairs. On the table, we found a candle and a faded yellowed map with strange symbols and indecipherable annotations. Our curiosity grew as we tried to make sense of the map. Before we could make any deductions, a sudden noise made us jump. We turned sharply towards the door and realized that it had slammed shut, trapping us inside the room. Panic gripped us as we frantically tried to open the door, which seemed to be blocked by an invisible force. We couldn't understand how it was possible. We tried to justify the door closing with the strong wind that night, but we couldn't find an explanation for why the door was stuck, as if someone was holding it shut from the other side. We decided to examine the map more closely, hoping it would provide us with some clues on how to escape from that situation. Its indecipherable annotations and mysterious symbols now seemed to have a deeper meaning, as if they were connected to the mystery of the house itself. However, before we could make any progress, another unsettling event occurred. Brian's flashlight began to flicker and suddenly went out, enveloping us in partial darkness. Our anxiety grew as we struggled to stay calm. At that moment, we heard a faint whisper, almost inaudible but real enough to send shivers down our spines. It seemed to say to leave that place to rest in peace, and that it would be the only time we were allowed to do so. We ran towards the door, and to our surprise, it was now open. For that brief moment, it was as if someone or something had given us the chance to decide, and if we hadn't taken it, we would probably have regretted it. We couldn't help but wonder what had happened in that place to generate so much evil. Probably that house had a dark past. Surely something tragic had happened inside. Without wasting time, we fled from the room and immediately left the house. Even today, I can't forget that terrible night. It will remain forever an unsolved mystery, a vivid memory of an experience that I hope never happens again in my entire life. When I was 16 years old, I was part of my high school volleyball team. That year, we were particularly fit, which led us to be invited to participate in a tournament in Chicago. I remember we stayed at a modest motel about 40 minutes away from the location where the tournament would take place. When we arrived, it was already evening, around 11 p.m. if I'm not mistaken. Our coach divided us into groups for the rooms. Me and 4 other friends, whom I was very close to at that time, were assigned room number 13. The room was more than pleasant. As soon as we crossed the threshold, we found ourselves in a cozy and comfortable environment. Among jokes, laughter, and confidences, time flew by like leaves carried by the wind. 2 hours passed without us realizing it, and aware of the need to face the next day with energy and vigor, we decided to end the evening and go to bed. Just as we lay down on the bed, the sudden sound of the phone in the room made us jump. Who could be calling at that late hour? Curiosity, accompanied by a subtle sense of unease, prompted me to get up and answer the call. "Yes. Hello?" I said, lifting the receiver with a mixture of curiosity and fear. From the other end of the line, a hoarse and thin voice replied, "Sorry, girls, for disturbing you at this hour, but I need to inform you of something. It's important." "Who is this?" I asked, trying to recognize the voice. "I'm the owner of the motel. Unfortunately, I have to inform you that your room has an electrical problem, and we need to assign you another one. It's better that one of you comes here to the reception so that I can give you another accommodation." My heart began to beat quickly in my chest. It seemed strange to me. We hadn't noticed anything wrong with the room's electrical system. However, given the urgency and concern for safety, we couldn't ignore it and had to take it seriously. I told him that one of us would come to the reception in a few minutes to sort out the matter. "Who wants to come with me to the reception?" I asked my friends, trying to hide the anxiety that was overwhelming me. Silent, we looked at each other for a moment before one of them volunteered. So my friend and I left the room and headed to the motel reception, chatting distractedly as darkness enveloped the outside of the building. Suddenly, from one of the rooms adjacent to ours, a man with a strange appearance and a dark hood emerged. His sudden presence filled us with a sense of unease, and we instinctively stopped. The man looked at us for a moment with a gaze full of mystery and ambiguity, then began to move in our direction with determined steps, without saying a word. He was breathing heavily, and his face looked tired as if he hadn't slept for days. My friend and I locked eyes with a silent understanding. Without hesitation, we began to quickly move away, with our hearts pounding in our chests as we headed back to our room. The tension in the air was palpable. Meanwhile, the man began to quicken his pace and move towards us. I don't know if he heard our screams, but fortunately, at that moment, our coach emerged from the room, noticing the scene, and promptly intervened by shouting at the man to leave. Our coach reached us in a run, visibly worried, and asked if we were okay. With a sigh of relief, we nodded and explained the situation to him. Immediately after, accompanied by our coach, we went to the reception to ask the receptionist if he had called our room earlier, and if he knew who the man we were talking about was. As we suspected, the receptionist told us that it wasn't him who called our room, and that he didn't know who the man we were referring to was. However, he told us that guests from one of the rooms had called earlier to the reception because they heard strange noises coming from the room next to theirs. This made us suppose that it was probably that man trying to do who knows what. At that point, we decided to return to our room, but we were restless. Every noise we heard made us jump. Despite trying to relax and fall asleep, thoughts continued to race through our minds. Who was that man? What did he want from us? The feeling of unease kept us awake all night, and when we finally managed to close our eyes, it was already dawn. The next day, despite the poor quality of sleep, we woke up determined to give our best at the tournament. We had been preparing for months for that moment, and we wouldn't allow an unpleasant episode to ruin that magnificent experience. With our minds focused on the playing field, we managed to overcome the initial adversities and achieve great results. Our team was compact, determined, and that feeling of unity gave us the strength to face every challenge with courage. After the conclusion of the tournament, we returned home with hearts full of satisfaction for the success achieved. But that night at the motel remained with us like a persistent shadow in our minds. We couldn't forget the agitation and fear that had overcome us in the presence of that man. Even today, who he was and what he wanted remains an unresolved enigma, a question that continues to haunt us. My name is Gary, and I'm a former police officer. I want to tell you about one of the most unsettling cases I had to deal with during my long career. I hung up my badge 6 years ago at the age of 59. The story I'm about to tell you dates back to my early years of service when I was still young and inexperienced. I remember it was an evening in November of 1987, if I'm not mistaken, November 13th, when we received a call from a woman around 40 years old who lived with her older sister. She told us that her sister Patricia had been going through a rough time lately due to the breakup with her ex-boyfriend, and that evening she had barricaded herself in the attic, saying she was tired of life and wanted to end it. We told her not to worry and that we would be there soon. Without wasting time, my colleague Liam and I immediately set off from the police station and headed to the address of the residence. The house was in the middle of nowhere, next to a dense forest. That evening, the wind was blowing strongly, rustling the surrounding trees. Once we arrived, we got out of the car and headed towards the house. The only sound we heard was the echo of our footsteps on the wooden porch floor. With bated breath, we approached the front door and knocked, but no one answered. We tried knocking a second time, but nothing. It seemed like no one was home. At that point, Liam kicked the door in, and we finally entered the house. Once inside, we tried to flip the light switch, but there seemed to be no power. The house was very large, with a total of 2 levels and an attic. "Is anyone there?" I called out, but no one responded. A moment later, I heard a faint woman's voice, almost a whisper, saying, "I'm here, help me." We rushed upstairs and tried to figure out where the voice was coming from. "Ma'am, where are you? We can't figure out where you are," Liam said. Suddenly, the front door on the first floor slammed shut. Liam and I exchanged worried glances, aware that there was something strange in that house. We headed towards the attic since the woman on the phone had informed us that her sister had barricaded herself there. With uncertain steps, we began to climb the stairs. Once we reached the attic door, we tried calling out again. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" No one answered. Having no other choice, we decided to kick down the attic door as well, and once inside, we found no trace of the woman. The strange thing was that besides the absence of the woman who had barricaded herself in that attic, there was no trace of her sister either, who had called the station for help. The absence of both women only fueled the mystery surrounding the situation even more. We decided to search the attic, hoping to find something that could shed some light on the strange situation. Inside, the smell was disgusting, almost like decay. We noticed there was a desk. We began searching through the various drawers, hoping to find some useful clues. After about 30 minutes of searching, we had checked every corner without finding anything that could help us. However, we realized that we hadn't examined an old trunk lying at the back of the room. It was a medium-sized trunk locked with a keyless padlock. My few years of experience had taught me something. With a pointed wire, I managed to open the lock, but when we saw the contents of the trunk, we were petrified. Inside were remnants of decomposing food. I don't know how long they had been there. We wondered who could have done such a thing and for what strange reason. An instant later, we left the attic. The smell was unbearable. We continued searching inside the house for that woman and her sister, but there was no trace of them. So we decided to leave. Once outside the house, we got into the car. As we were maneuvering the car, we noticed from the window that someone turned on a light in the attic. We got out of the car and hurriedly headed towards the stairs to go up to the attic, see what was happening, and who had turned on that light. But unfortunately, as soon as we reached the second floor, the light went out. We entered the attic to check if there was anyone there, but nothing. The only thing we noticed was that the trunk we had left open was now closed. We didn't know what to think. A situation like that had never happened to me before. We decided to leave definitively from there. As soon as we got into the car, someone turned on a light again in the house, but this time on the second floor. It seemed like someone was playing a trick on us. We decided to ignore it, starting to think that there might be something paranormal in that house, something we would never be able to explain. Since that day, no more calls have come from that house. However, I'm sure there's something strange inside, something that will never be brought to light. After nearly 7 years, I had finally managed to land that new job I had been longing for. Not only was it professionally stimulating, but it also allowed me to earn more. So, I decided to bid farewell to my old home, a modest apartment that had witnessed my life grow and change over the past few years. I resolved to search Craigslist listings to find a new place more suited to my needs. Among the various listings, one stood out for its enticing description: bright apartment, in excellent condition, furnished. Great, I thought. This meant I wouldn't have to spend extra money on furniture. I decided to schedule an appointment to view it 3 days later. I remember it was a Monday. When I met the landlord, he turned out to be a kind and elegant man. He immediately gave me a good impression. He told me that the apartment had been vacant for 2 years, despite its excellent condition. This information left me perplexed, but I decided not to dwell on it too much. The rent was $900, which seemed like a reasonable amount for the area. After viewing the apartment, I told him I would make a decision within 2 days. The next day, I called the landlord and informed him that I would take the apartment. We met to sign the lease, and I gave him the first month's rent and the required deposit. I started moving in right away, and after a week, I was finally at home in my new abode. The first few nights passed quietly, but after a while, I began to hear strange noises coming from the walls. They started softly, almost imperceptible, but as the days went by, they became more persistent and disturbing. After a month, I was at my wit's end. Those strange noises were driving me crazy, preventing me from sleeping soundly at night. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. I decided to call the landlord to ask for an explanation. He wasn't surprised and told me he was already aware of it. He informed me that other tenants had also experienced the same problem, and that the cause of those noises was unclear. I decided to wait a little longer, hoping that the noises would stop, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. In fact, the more time passed, the worse it seemed to get. Desperate, I called the landlord again to inform him of my decision to terminate the lease agreement, as the situation had become unbearable. I always felt there was something strange in that house, something mysterious and supernatural, something beyond human understanding. Despite not being able to provide a rational explanation, I felt there was a presence, a kind of negative energy trying to make me understand that I didn't belong there. With a bit of dismay, I prepared to find another place to live. That apartment, so promising at first, turned out to be a nightmare that I was no longer willing to endure. Two years ago, my husband and I moved to a new neighborhood. After a while, we got to know our neighbors, a childless couple. Living with them was the wife's brother named Paul, who was 45 years old, unemployed, and had mental issues, along with a drinking problem. Right away, we noticed something strange about his behavior and habits. He was always very reserved, rarely seen interacting with the other neighbors, and preferred to spend his time in the backyard, lost in his thoughts and making strange hand movements. Despite our efforts to establish a friendly relationship, he always seemed distant and uninterested in conversation. My husband was usually at work in the mornings and didn't return home until around 5 p.m. Lately, Paul had been increasingly unsettling for me. From the kitchen window, I could see him in the backyard, seemingly staring at me all the time. The feeling of being constantly watched made me uncomfortable and restless. I tried to ignore his presence and focus on my household chores, but his constant presence unsettled me. One day, while I was home alone, I heard a knock on the door. I was surprised, as rarely did anyone visit me without notice. When I opened the door, I was shocked to see Paul standing there. He said he needed company because he was alone at home. I let him in and made him a coffee. He started looking at me in a way that bothered me. Fortunately, after a while, his sister arrived to take him back home. 2 days later, I saw Paul heading towards my house. As soon as I heard a knock on the door, my heart skipped a beat. It was Paul again. He said he wanted to show me something. My mind started racing with 1,000 thoughts, and my heart pounded as I realized the situation was escalating. Suddenly, Paul, without my consent, entered the house. He grabbed my arm and brought my hand towards his jeans. I was speechless. I immediately pulled my arm away, telling him in a trembling voice never to dare approach me in that way again, and that I would immediately inform his sister of his behavior. I went straight to his sister and told her what had happened. She was visibly shocked and didn't know how to apologize for her brother's behavior. When my husband came home, I explained everything that had happened both that day and 2 days prior. His reaction was a mix of anger and concern. He said he didn't feel comfortable leaving me alone while he was at work, knowing that Paul could be nearby. We decided to move. After 2 weeks, we found a new house and moved. Fortunately, I managed to stop Paul before the situation could worsen any further. I don't even want to imagine what would have happened if things had gone differently. Last year, a friend and I were on a trip to meet 2 girls we had met online who lived in a city about 200 miles away from us. We had planned this meeting for some time and were looking forward to getting to know them. Although the distance by car was relatively short, we decided to leave the night before and stop for the night at a motel. This choice allowed us to arrive fresh and rested the next day, after a refreshing shower, and to avoid arriving sweaty and smelly due to the intense heat. We stopped at a motel located near their city, a distance that would only require half an hour's drive to reach the girls the next day. Once we arrived, we entered the motel's reception. The facility wasn't bad for $40 a night. The walls were decorated with paintings depicting local landscapes, and there were some comfortable armchairs for waiting customers. The guy behind the counter welcomed us with a friendly smile and asked if we had a reservation. After confirming, he handed us the keys to our room and showed us the way to get there. Finally, he wished us a good night and said we could reach out to him for anything we needed. With the keys in hand, we headed to our room, ready to rest and prepare for the next day. Upon arriving in our room, we found ourselves in a cozy and clean environment. The room was simply but comfortably furnished, with a double bed covered with fresh, clean sheets. On the walls were paintings of relaxing landscapes that contributed to creating a tranquil and soothing atmosphere. Both my friend and I were quite excited for the next day, which didn't allow us to fall asleep peacefully, so we decided to turn on the TV to relax a bit. After about 5 or 10 minutes, we began to hear noises coming from one of the adjacent rooms. They didn't seem to come from the room next to ours, but rather from the next one. We started to wonder what could be causing those strange noises. We decided to step out of our room and take a look outside. When I opened the door, I noticed that the 2 doors of the rooms next to ours were wide open. In the first room there was no one, and neither was there in the second, but in the second room, we noticed that someone had left the water tap open. We didn't know what to think, so we decided to go back to our room. However, as soon as we returned, the noises resumed, as if someone were banging against the walls. The situation was taking an unsettling turn, and we began to worry about what might happen. At that point, we decided to go to the reception and tell them what was happening. As soon as we arrived, we explained to the receptionist what had happened. With a concerned expression, he told us that those 2 rooms were empty and that he would check immediately. However, when the receptionist reached the door of the rooms, the doors were closed. The receptionist took the keys and opened them, and as soon as we entered, we immediately noticed that the bathroom tap was now closed. It was as if nothing had ever happened. We were baffled and confused. We didn't know what to think, but one thing was certain. We wouldn't be able to sleep peacefully that night. We thanked the receptionist for his intervention and, despite the confusion, decided to return to our room. Shortly after, however, the mysterious noises resumed. Of course, we couldn't completely ignore them, but we decided not to pay them too much attention. As soon as it was morning, we grabbed our things and quickly left the motel. To this day, we haven't been able to give an explanation for those mysterious noises. But one thing is certain. We were happy to leave that unsettling place and never set foot there again. For about 5 years, I have been passionately dedicated to working as a librarian in one of the oldest and most fascinating libraries in the city. It's a magical place, enveloped in the scent of books and illuminated by the dim light of reading lamps. Books have always been my greatest passion. That library had become my second home, a place where I felt comfortable. It was a Friday like any other, and my night shift had just begun. My colleague had left a few hours ago, leaving me alone. Usually I loved those quiet closing moments, but that night there was something different. As I was rearranging the shelves, I began to perceive a barely perceptible sound of footsteps and hushed whispers. I shook my head, trying to ignore those sounds and attributing them to fatigue. I decided to have a coffee to try to regain some energy. After a few minutes, I heard those noises again, as if someone were lurking in the shadows of the library, hiding. I decided to investigate, moving cautiously among the shelves. My heart was pounding, tension rising with every step I took. As I walked among the shelves, I noticed that from a row of books I had already sorted a little earlier, one was slightly protruding from the shelf, as if someone had just taken it and then abandoned it in a hurry. I decided not to think about it and returned to my work, but as soon as I turned around, I heard a faint rustle. I spun around and saw a shadow moving, almost imperceptibly. A shiver ran down my spine, and I yelled, "Who's there?" No answer. Just the dark silence of the empty library. "Show yourself!" I shouted. Suddenly, the shadow stopped. It stood there motionless for a few seconds before quickly retreating. I continued to walk among the shelves to try to understand more about that strange situation, and suddenly, I saw a man. He looked at me with frightened eyes. He was pale and sweaty, as if he had been running for a long time. He had a look of terror. "I'm sorry, miss," he stammered. "I didn't mean to disturb. I was just lost." His voice trembled slightly. I approached slowly, trying not to unsettle him. "What brought you here at this hour?" I asked cautiously, trying to remain calm despite being very agitated. The man hesitated for a moment, as if he were evaluating whether he could trust me or not. Then, with a sigh, he let go and began to tell me about a shadow. I immediately understood that he was talking about the same shadow I had glimpsed a little earlier. "I was being chased," he confessed, his voice trembling. "I don't know by whom or what, but they were chasing me." Before he could finish the sentence, a sudden noise echoed through the library, abruptly interrupting him. We looked at each other, both seized by a growing sense of panic. "We need to get out of here," I said firmly, grabbing his hand and dragging him towards the exit. "Now!" Hastily, we made our way to the library's exit. Fortunately, we were unharmed, but that situation left us with a series of unanswered questions. Who was that shadow we had seen in the library? What was that noise? As soon as we stepped outside, I immediately called the police to report what had happened. The police arrived shortly after, and we began to tell them everything in detail. After that night, a constant presence of a night guard was established for the next few months inside the library. That incident had shaken me. Every night as I carried out my shift, I scrutinized every corner of the library, remaining vigilant and ready to face whatever might happen. The presence of the night guard certainly helped me feel safer during my shifts. Knowing that there was someone watchful and ready to intervene if necessary gave me a sense of tranquility and protection. Since that day, fortunately, no other strange events have occurred, and the atmosphere in the library has returned to normal. The shadow I saw that night has never reappeared, and its mystery remains unsolved. For several years, I have always been a frequent user of Craigslist. Due to the presence of unreliable individuals around, as a precaution, I have always preferred to meet buyers or sellers in public places and establish telephone contact before the meeting. For me, Craigslist represented the most practical way to sell unused items or find good deals. However, after the experience I'm about to tell you, I have never bought or sold online again, even though I must admit that often you can find some really good deals. About 6 months ago, I was looking for a camera. I needed one as I had planned a trip with my family and needed it as soon as possible. After a quick search on Craigslist, I found a used one at a great price. After contacting the seller via email, we agreed to meet that same evening at a gas station about 40 minutes away from my house. The seller informed me that, as he was returning from visiting some relatives, he wouldn't be able to come before 10 p.m. I was hesitant to accept, considering the late hour, but having no other choice, I agreed. That evening, when I arrived at the gas station at 10 p.m., the seller had not yet arrived. I waited patiently for 10 minutes and then called him. He told me he was on his way. I waited another 20 minutes and started to get nervous. So, I decided to leave. As I was about to start my car's engine, an old orange Cadillac pulled into the gas station and stopped next to my car. Inside was a man about 60 years old smoking a cigar. Shortly after, he got out of the car and started walking towards me. He was wearing a leather jacket, jeans, and black boots. "You must be John," he said. "That's right," I replied. The man stared at me, making me feel uncomfortable. Shortly after, he opened the trunk of his car and took out the camera. As I checked the camera, I noticed there was liquid on the battery. I immediately realized it needed to be replaced. I asked the seller how long he had had the camera. His answer was vague. He said, "A little while." I expressed my concern to the seller about the battery and told him I no longer wanted to buy it because I felt that, considering the value of the camera, it wasn't worth replacing the battery. The man began to insist and claim that the camera was in excellent condition. At that point, I told him to stop trying to fool me and that the battery needed to be replaced. Annoyed, I turned around and walked towards my car. Once inside the car, the man opened the door and pulled me out, exclaiming angrily, "Friend, I traveled 50 miles to come here. Now who's going to reimburse me for the fuel expenses?" I replied that it was not my concern and told him to calm down, or else I would call the police. At that point, the man turned around and headed towards his car, muttering incomprehensible words. He got in and drove off, screeching his tires. I sat in the car for a few minutes, thinking about what had happened, while the smell of burning rubber filled the air. After a few minutes, I started the engine and headed home. On that road, I was alone, the only sound being the engine of my car. I couldn't help but think about what had happened. After that evening, I decided never to meet sellers or buyers at night and in isolated places again. It was an experience that scared me a lot. Being alone in such a vulnerable situation made me realize how important it is to be cautious and never take anything for granted. Last year, during a road trip, I found myself in a rather unusual situation. I was searching for a place to spend the night when I stumbled upon a small motel along the way. The structure was located in an isolated area and didn't look appealing from the outside at all. Given the late hour and the area I was in, I didn't have any alternatives, so I decided to stop anyway. As I pulled into the motel parking lot, I noticed there were no cars parked except for a pickup truck, presumably belonging to the motel manager. It seemed strange that all the rooms were vacant, considering it was an isolated area but still a thoroughfare. I decided not to dwell on it and headed towards the entrance. As soon as I entered the reception area, I was greeted by a man with a strange appearance. He had an unkempt beard and a disturbing look in his eyes. He didn't give me a good impression, but as I mentioned earlier, I didn't have much choice. After a brief and uncomfortable interaction with the man, he handed me the room keys. I was assigned room number 12. It was the most isolated and furthest from the reception, located at the far end on the left. Given the unsettling atmosphere of the place, I asked if it was possible to have a room closer to the reception, saying it would be more convenient for me. Obviously, I didn't tell the real reason to avoid revealing my fear and discomfort. My request was denied as I was told that the rooms closer to the reception hadn't been cleaned yet, which seemed strange and clearly an excuse, given that there was no one around, and they would have had plenty of time to tidy up any occupied rooms from the previous night. I was told that the only alternative available to room number 12 would be room number 19, located on the other side of the motel, also very far from the reception. At that point, not knowing what else to say, I accepted room number 12. As soon as I stepped into the room, I was engulfed in a heavy atmosphere. The floor was covered in dust, the bed was crumpled, and the sheets were not exactly clean. It almost seemed like it hadn't been remade. The furniture, on the other hand, looked very dated. There was an old television set on one of them. I decided to turn it on to distract myself a bit, but soon noticed that not all channels were working. I tried to tune them in to keep me company, but to no avail. I lay down on the bed, and despite being dead tired, I couldn't completely relax. That place was giving me incredible anxiety. I had a constant feeling of being watched for some reason. Every now and then I looked around, but there was never anyone there. Around midnight, as I tried to fall asleep, I heard a strange noise coming from outside the room. I thought it was just my imagination overwhelmed by tiredness, but a moment later, I distinctly heard the handle of my door slowly turning. With my heart pounding wildly, I immediately got up from the bed and approached the door. I flung it open, and in the darkness, I caught a glimpse of a shadow swiftly moving away. My first instinct was to scream, but something held me back. I immediately grabbed the phone and dialed the reception number, telling the man there that there was someone lurking outside the motel. The man on the other end of the line didn't seem surprised, but said he would take a look around. I always doubted that he did what he said. I decided to get back into bed, but shortly after I was woken up by some noises, this time seeming to come from the window. It was clear by now that someone was trying to break into the room. I approached the window and again noticed that shadow peering into my room, then quickly retreating as soon as it noticed my presence. I quickly closed the curtains with a rough gesture, trying to fend off the growing sense of dread inside me, and returned to bed. Sleep was now just a dream. I was too agitated. I fervently hoped that whoever was out there wouldn't show up again. But unfortunately, after about half an hour, I heard noises again from outside the room. At that point, I grabbed my suitcase and decided it was time to leave. That night had become a nightmare. It was around 4 a.m. when I stepped out of the room and closed the door behind me. With swift steps and trying to make as little noise as possible, I headed towards my car. In the parking lot in the distance, I saw a figure staring at me. I presumed it was the same person who had been watching me for several hours. Without wasting any more time, I got into the car, started the engine, and drove away from that cursed place, hoping to never encounter that dark individual again. After driving several miles and making sure I had distanced myself enough from that place, I began to reflect on the fact that I couldn't just forget what had happened. So, as soon as I found an area with signal, I decided to call the police to report the incident. An officer on the phone listened to everything I had to say and told me they would go to the scene immediately to conduct investigations. But as I feared, they found nothing. Despite this, I decided to do everything I could to inform other travelers of the potential danger of that motel. I wrote a long, detailed review on the website where the motel was listed, recounting my experience and warning anyone interested in staying there, hoping that my words could save someone else from experiencing what I went through. After about a month, I read the news that the motel had closed down. I don't know if my review contributed to this, but I felt a sense of relief knowing that no one else would have to experience the same situation as me. It was an experience I would hardly forget, but at the same time, I am glad to be able to tell it. About 2 years ago, I moved to Greenfield in a very quiet neighborhood. My new house was on 3 levels and had a large garden. That house was really big for just one person, but I've always loved spacious areas that allow me to move freely and enjoy a sense of freedom and comfort. Near my house, there were 7 other residences, and one of them was Mrs. Johnson's residence, a wealthy woman who lived with her 3 dogs and her maid, Allison. Since becoming a widow, Mrs. Johnson had developed an obsession with the Smith family, who lived in the house next to hers. It was said that she scrutinized their every move, as if the mere thought of the Smiths filled her with terror. The Smith family consisted of 6 people. During the day, they seemed like a normal family, like any other. But at night, strange noises emanated from their home, sending shivers through the entire neighborhood. It was said they had a daughter, Emily, who had never been seen in public. There were rumors circulating that Emily was trapped inside the house, confined to a dark room and forgotten by the outside world. But there was no certainty about any of this. Despite several reports from neighbors to the police during various checks, the officers had never found anything strange. Mr. Anderson, across the street, was convinced that the Smiths were involved in dark practices. I don't know why he had this idea, perhaps because of the strange noises coming from their home. He was firmly convinced that they were hiding something horrible, probably in their basement. Occasionally, he dared to peek through the window, seeking confirmation of his suspicions. One day, around 2 p.m., the door of the Smiths' house was left ajar as the family left. It was an unusual event, almost unthinkable, considering how careful and reserved the Smiths usually were. It was definitely a distraction, otherwise they would never have left the door open. Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Johnson, and I happened to be near the Smiths' house when we noticed the door ajar. That moment was like a wake-up call for us, an opportunity we couldn't let slip away. We finally had to find out what was happening behind those walls. We couldn't remain in uncertainty and continue to live that way. The situation in the neighborhood was becoming increasingly tense, with gossip spreading among the residents. Every little detail about the Smiths became a topic of discussion among the neighbors, fueling curiosity and suspicion. I, too, was not immune to this atmosphere of mystery. Every time I passed by the Smiths' house, I felt a shiver down my spine, as if something sinister lurked behind those walls. Despite the fear and anxiety that engulfed us, curiosity and determination to resolve the situation drove us to act. It was time to put an end to all the mysteries that had been tormenting the entire neighborhood for too long. With my heart pounding furiously in my chest, we looked into each other's eyes and encouraged one another. We had to enter that house at any cost to finally uncover the truth. With uncertain steps, we approached the slightly open door. Once inside, we found ourselves in an eerie dimness, with silence seeming to envelop every corner of the house. Our gaze scanned every corner of the house, searching for clues that could reveal the secrets hidden by the Smiths. Despite our searches, we couldn't find anything suspicious. At that point, we decided to check if Mr. Anderson's suspicion that there was something in the basement was true. We headed towards the door, but unfortunately, it was locked, which made us suspicious. Why would anyone lock a door when only family members are at home? What could be the reason? That detail couldn't go unnoticed and only served to further fuel our suspicions about what was hidden down there. We looked at each other, tension mounting. We had to find a way to open that door and discover what lay behind it. We decided to search the house for something that could help us open the basement door. After about 10 minutes of frantic searching, we found nothing that could help us. The lock seemed to be of a particular type, much more complex than we had imagined, making it almost impossible to open without its key. So we decided to focus on finding the key itself. We inspected every corner of the house, looking inside every drawer, wardrobe, piece of furniture, and anywhere it could be hiding. However, despite our efforts, we couldn't find any trace of the basement key. Frustration began to set in, and the tension between us intensified. We knew the basement key had to be somewhere, but where? It was clear that it had been carefully hidden. Suddenly, Mrs. Johnson let out a cry of joy and exclaimed, "There's a key behind that painting. Let's hope it's the one." Mrs. Johnson had noticed something unusual behind one of the paintings hanging on the wall. The fabric keychain was slightly hanging from the back of the painting. At that point, we headed towards the basement door, hoping that the key we had just found was the right one. When we inserted the key into the lock and turned it for the first time, a shiver ran down our spines. It was. The fact that the key had been so carefully hidden and had opened the basement door almost confirmed to us that there was something strange down there, something that the Smiths had tried to keep hidden at all costs. I flicked the light switch and we began to descend the stairs with our hearts in our throats, the fear of what we might find down there accompanying us with every step. When we finally reached the bottom of the stairs and found ourselves in the basement, we were speechless at what we saw. A large table dominated the room. On it were laid out old prayer books, candles casting a dim light, and various scented essences filling the air with an intense, almost unsettling aroma. Around the table, various photos of people were scattered, some of them faded with time. The sight of that place confirmed Mr. Anderson's suspicions. He was right. Rituals were performed in that basement. Tension grew as we looked at each other in disbelief. Suddenly, While we were in the basement, we heard noises coming from outside. It was the Smiths' car parking in the garden. We immediately understood that we had to leave that place as soon as possible. Without wasting time, we ran up the basement stairs. I hurried as fast as possible to the painting to put the key back in place and not leave any trace of our presence. Fortunately, just as the Smiths returned home, we managed to escape through a window. At that point, realizing that we could no longer ignore what we had discovered in that house, we decided to immediately call the police. After a few minutes, the officers arrived on the scene, ready to address the situation. We explained to them what we had discovered in the Smiths' basement, telling them about the rituals and everything we had seen down there. The officers listened carefully to our words, and when they were convinced of the seriousness of the situation, they decided to intervene. They approached the door of the Smiths' house and knocked firmly. When Mrs. Smith opened the door, the officers explained that they needed to conduct a check because some neighbors had complained of hearing the usual noises coming from their home. With some reluctance, Mrs. Smith consented to the inspection. The officers asked to open the basement and verified with their own eyes what we had described to them. At that point, the officers informed the Smiths that from that moment on, if there were any further complaints from neighbors about strange noises or suspicious activities, they would have to leave that house. The decision had been made to ensure the safety and tranquility of the neighborhood. With relieved hearts, we watched as the officers walked away from the Smiths' house, carrying with them the promise of a better future for our neighborhood. The truth had finally been brought to light, and now it was up to the Smiths to decide their fate. For about 5 years, I have been passionately dedicated to working as a librarian in one of the oldest and most fascinating libraries in the city. It's a magical place, enveloped in the scent of books and illuminated by the dim light of reading lamps. Books have always been my greatest passion. That library had become my second home, a place where I felt comfortable. It was a Friday like any other, and my night shift had just begun. My colleague had left a few hours ago, leaving me alone. Usually I loved those quiet closing moments, but that night there was something different. As I was rearranging the shelves, I began to perceive a barely perceptible sound of footsteps and hushed whispers. I shook my head, trying to ignore those sounds and attributing them to fatigue. I decided to have a coffee to try to regain some energy. After a few minutes, I heard those noises again, as if someone were lurking in the shadows of the library, hiding. I decided to investigate, moving cautiously among the shelves. My heart was pounding, tension rising with every step I took. As I walked among the shelves, I noticed that from a row of books I had already sorted a little earlier, one was slightly protruding from the shelf, as if someone had just taken it and then abandoned it in a hurry. I decided not to think about it and returned to my work, but as soon as I turned around, I heard a faint rustle. I spun around and saw a shadow moving, almost imperceptibly. A shiver ran down my spine, and I yelled, "Who's there?" No answer. Just the dark silence of the empty library. "Show yourself!" I shouted. Suddenly, the shadow stopped. It stood there motionless for a few seconds before quickly retreating. I continued to walk among the shelves to try to understand more about that strange situation, and suddenly, I saw a man. He looked at me with frightened eyes. He was pale and sweaty, as if he had been running for a long time. He had a look of terror. "I'm sorry, miss," he stammered. "I didn't mean to disturb. I was just lost." His voice trembled slightly. I approached slowly, trying not to unsettle him. "What brought you here at this hour?" I asked cautiously, trying to remain calm despite being very agitated. The man hesitated for a moment, as if he were evaluating whether he could trust me or not. Then, with a sigh, he let go and began to tell me about a shadow. I immediately understood that he was talking about the same shadow I had glimpsed a little earlier. "I was being chased," he confessed, his voice trembling. "I don't know by whom or what, but they were chasing me." Before he could finish the sentence, a sudden noise echoed through the library, abruptly interrupting him. We looked at each other, both seized by a growing sense of panic. "We need to get out of here," I said firmly, grabbing his hand and dragging him towards the exit. "Now!" Hastily, we made our way to the library's exit. Fortunately, we were unharmed, but that situation left us with a series of unanswered questions. Who was that shadow we had seen in the library? What was that noise? As soon as we stepped outside, I immediately called the police to report what had happened. The police arrived shortly after, and we began to tell them everything in detail. After that night, a constant presence of a night guard was established for the next few months inside the library. That incident had shaken me. Every night as I carried out my shift, I scrutinized every corner of the library, remaining vigilant and ready to face whatever might happen. The presence of the night guard certainly helped me feel safer during my shifts. Knowing that there was someone watchful and ready to intervene if necessary gave me a sense of tranquility and protection. Since that day, fortunately, no other strange events have occurred, and the atmosphere in the library has returned to normal. The shadow I saw that night has never reappeared, and its mystery remains unsolved. It was a night some years ago. The sky was covered with clouds and distant thunder could be heard, a sign that a strong storm would soon reach us. My mother, my father, and I were on a journey to visit some relatives we hadn't seen in a while. Given the weather conditions, we decided to stop at a motel along the road to spend the night. We were exhausted after hours of traveling and were looking forward to getting some rest. After checking in, we entered the room, and honestly, the first impression wasn't the best. The walls of the room were completely faded, the lights flickering. It wasn't a nice place at all. Personally, I didn't like sleeping away from home. It always made me anxious, and I must say that place didn't help at all. After about 15-20 minutes, we got into bed, exhausted. However, in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a dull noise coming from inside the room. From the dim light, I saw a shadow moving in the darkness, but I couldn't make out any details. Strangely, shortly after, without realizing it, I fell asleep again. About an hour later, I woke up again, disturbed by the same noises. I looked at the clock on the nightstand. It read 4:15 in the morning. I got up from bed cautiously, trying not to make too much noise to wake my parents. I walked slowly towards the source of the noise, which seemed to be coming from the bathroom. When I reached the door, I flung it open, but there was no one inside. Perhaps it was just the sound of the wind, I thought. Or maybe my imagination was playing tricks on me. I decided to wake up my father, seeking comfort in his presence. "Dad, there's something strange in the bathroom," I said anxiously. He woke up suddenly, his eyes still blurry with sleep. He followed me into the bathroom to take a look around, but we found nothing suspicious. "You must have been dreaming, son," my father said reassuringly. But I wasn't convinced. That sense of unease persisted. Then, as I scanned the room carefully, I noticed that the shower faucet was dripping incessantly. "Look, Dad," I said, pointing to the faucet. "Maybe it was just this that I heard." My father approached and examined the faucet. "It could be," he said, giving a twist to the valve to stop the water leak. "Maybe this is what woke you up." I decided to go back to bed, hoping to finally find some peace, but as soon as I closed my eyes, a sound broke the silence of the room. It was a strange sound, like a muffled whistle. I had to find out. With some fear, I hurried out of bed and ran to the bathroom. When I reached the door, a faint voice echoed in the air. "Help, please. Help." I realized that the whistle was not coming from inside the room, but from outside the bathroom window. Looking out, I noticed a man crouched on the ground. His presence was unsettling and sent shivers down my spine. Without hesitation, I called my father and told him about the man outside the window. My father, becoming irritated, got up from bed. After checking the man from the bathroom window, he headed towards the door and went outside the motel towards him. I ran after him, trying to hold him back and shouting, "Dad, stop! It's dangerous!" But it seemed like he couldn't hear me. With determined steps, he approached the man with a stern look and clenched fists and yelled angrily, "What are you doing here on the ground? What do you want? You're scaring my son!" The man slowly got up, looked my father in the eyes, and said that the room was his and that we had to leave. After a brief discussion that was about to turn into a fight, we decided to go back into the motel and went back to bed. After a while, someone knocked on the window. We went outside the motel again, but there was no one. My father, visibly annoyed, decided to call the motel reception to report what had happened. After a brief conversation, they assured us that they would send someone to check the situation. After about 10 minutes, there was a knock on our room door. It was the motel manager, accompanied by a security guard. They informed us that they had checked the surroundings and had not found anyone matching the description of the man we had seen. We didn't know what to say or think, so we thanked them and returned to our room. Given the accumulated tension, we stayed awake for the rest of the night. A few hours later, the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains. At that point, we packed our bags, handed the keys to the motel staff, and left the place in a hurry. As we drove away, we watched the motel getting farther and farther in the rearview mirror. With a sigh of relief, we realized that we had left behind that stormy night. As the hours passed, the tension gradually faded, replaced by a feeling of relief and gratitude for having come out unscathed from that absurd situation. About 3 years ago, me and 3 of my friends, John, Sarah, and Michael, decided to explore a place we had always wanted to visit, an old, abandoned bunker outside of town. That evening, rain and wind unleashed a storm that seemed to want to overturn the world. Let's say it wasn't exactly the right night for such exploration, but our thirst for adventure and the desire to challenge our fears drove us to do it. Since John was out with his family that evening, we decided to meet at an old bar on a state road around 3:00 a.m., where we took the chance to have breakfast. Later, we got into the car and headed towards the bunker. After about half an hour of travel, we arrived. We got out of the car, and that place was completely dark, the only light coming from our flashlights. I won't deny that once we got there, the idea of leaving crossed our minds. It was an unsettling context, to say the least. We decided not to dwell on it too much and to proceed, approaching the entrance of the bunker with determination. The metal doors seemed to have been shut for years, rusty and heavy. With some effort, we managed to open them. Once inside, we found ourselves in a narrow and dusty corridor. The smell of mold almost suffocated us. The flashlight barely illuminated enough for us to see the rough ground and the abandoned objects along the way. We proceeded cautiously, traversing long corridors that seemed to have no end. Occasionally, we thought we heard noises in the distance, but apparently there was nothing. Everything seemed quiet. At one point, we found ourselves in a large room where we found old, rusty military equipment, broken furniture, and empty ammunition boxes. As we continued our exploration, we found something disturbing: dirty and worn-out sheets with faded writings. The words were barely readable, but what we managed to decipher sent shivers down our spines. They spoke of secret experiments conducted in the bunker during the war, of human subjects used as guinea pigs, and of terrible consequences that ensued. From time to time, we heard strange noises coming from the surrounding darkness. They sounded like light footsteps, as if someone was walking on tiptoe. We tried several times to figure out the source of those noises, but each time they seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving us in silence. Despite our growing sense of unease, we continued our exploration. As we ventured towards the end of the bunker, a sudden noise made us jump. Our instinct drove us to instinctively crouch down as we looked up with eyes wide open with fear. An old rusty can, now degraded by time, had fallen from one of the shelves in that room. We couldn't explain how it was possible. We decided it was time to leave that place. There was something in there stronger than us. We quickly turned back to return to the door we had entered through, but once we got there, we realized it was blocked, just like when we entered. Maybe it was the rust, maybe some other dark force trying to hold us back in that place. I don't know what it was, but we didn't like it. After about 10 minutes of exhausting efforts, the door finally opened. We were exhausted from the tension, our hands and legs trembling. That night, in the abandoned bunker, will forever be etched in our minds. Surely we were a bit reckless to venture into such a dark and dangerous place in the dead of night, but curiosity outweighed reason. I realize we should never have risked our lives to satisfy a simple thirst for adventure. The lessons learned on that night of terror will always stay with me, and I can say with certainty that I will never again have such an experience. My friends agree with me too. It was an experience not to be repeated. I live in a small town of 10,000 inhabitants, and one July evening around 8 p.m., I was driving along a deserted road to reach the house of a dear friend of mine, which was about 30 miles away from mine. We had organized a dinner among friends. I know that road perfectly well as I have been traveling it for years, and generally, in the evening, I had never encountered anyone except rarely. At some point, I turned onto a dark lane. There was nothing around, just a vast expanse of countryside. Suddenly, I saw someone walking in the middle of the road, seemingly dragging something heavy. I slowed down and approached cautiously, hoping they would move aside. No luck. Whoever it was continued walking, without even turning to look. I began to feel uneasy, and a shiver ran down my spine. I immediately understood that there was something strange. After a few seconds, the figure turned towards me. It was a woman, but her face was completely shrouded in shadow. I was afraid, but a strange curiosity compelled me to get closer. I decided to roll down the car window and, with a trembling voice, asked, "Ma'am, do you need help?" I received no response. The woman remained motionless, almost as if she hadn't heard my question. Suddenly, she started approaching the car. Panicked, I accelerated and got out of there as quickly as possible. As I drove away, I nervously looked in the rearview mirror, but the woman was no longer there. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I couldn't believe it. Even today, I can't explain who she was and why she was there in the middle of the road. About 8 years ago, my family and I moved to a new neighborhood. I still remember the day we arrived, with the car full of boxes and the excitement of starting a new life. Our new home was located in a beautiful neighborhood. The houses all looked very similar, with well-kept gardens and colorful flower beds. Every now and then you could see the residents busy with their daily activities. Someone mowing the lawn, someone else watering the flowers, or taking the dog for a walk. Even our neighbors seemed like friendly and respectful people. The house next to ours was inhabited by a family consisting of a man, a woman, their son, and a friendly dog. The day we met them for the first time, the man, with a warm smile, introduced himself as Mark, his wife as Julia, and the boy as Matthew. Their dog, a Labrador named Rocky, greeted us with contagious energy, wagging his tail and jumping around us. Mark and Julia were always very kind and helpful. Matthew, a lively and curious boy, soon became friends with my son, spending entire days playing together in the backyard. In short, everything was perfect, or at least, it seemed so. After some time, we began to notice changes in our neighbors' behavior. As time passed, we noticed that Mark and Julia were becoming more and more reserved. They started not to leave the house anymore, and those rare times we met them, they seemed to always be in a hurry and with their heads in the clouds. We couldn't understand their sudden change. At that point, we decided to continue with our lives and not think about it anymore. One day, coming home from work, all the streets were crowded and some were even closed. I asked a man what had happened, and he told me that there had been a robbery at the neighborhood bank, and the robbers had managed to escape with the loot. After about an hour, I finally managed to get home. After spending about half an hour playing with my son, there was suddenly a power outage, and we were left in the dark. We tried to light up the house with the flashlights of our phones and some candles we had available. I went out into the backyard to see if the power outage was affecting only us or the entire neighborhood. As soon as I stepped out, I noticed with dismay that the whole neighborhood was shrouded in darkness. So I decided to go to the neighbor's door, Mark and Julia's, to ask them if they knew anything about the power outage. The door was open, but I still knocked gently so as not to be intrusive. After a while, not receiving an answer, I decided to enter. "Mark? Julia? Are you home?" I called as I advanced. Shortly after, I heard noises coming from the living room. I approached cautiously, and once inside, I found them with terrified expressions, unaware of my presence. The table was covered with banknotes, and they were busy counting them. At that moment, everything clicked in my mind. Their strange behavior in recent days and the bank robbery I had heard about. They were the ones who committed that crime. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know what to do, what to say. I was stunned by the shocking discovery I had made. I said to them, "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." And I turned to head towards the exit, but Mark ran after me, grabbing me by the collar of my shirt and threateningly said, "I hope you don't intend to spread this around. We've known each other for a while, and I don't think you're stupid enough to ruin our wonderful friendship." I promptly replied that it was not my intention at all, and that he could rest assured. I adjusted my collar and began to head towards the exit. Mark noticed that I was terrified and added with a mocking smile, "Don't worry, the power will be back soon. You don't have to be afraid of the dark." The situation left me bewildered and uneasy, and I thought I couldn't live with that weight on my shoulders. Once back home, I told my wife everything. We didn't know what to do. On one hand, we felt the need to turn to the police and report what we had discovered. On the other hand, however, we were aware that doing so would put our safety and tranquility at risk. Mark wouldn't make our lives easy if we told the authorities. It was clear that we would have to face difficult and perhaps dangerous consequences if we decided to act. In the end, we decided to tell everything to the police, knowing that afterward we would have to leave that place quickly. We started loading all our things into the car, and once finished, we went to the police station to tell them what had happened. The decision to leave everything behind and go was difficult to make, but we knew it was necessary to protect ourselves and our family from the risky situation we had become involved in. When we arrived at the police station, we told every detail of the encounter with Mark and Julia, of the shocking discovery we had made in their house. The officers thanked us for sharing that information with them and assured us that if we decided to stay, they would do everything possible to protect us. Despite this reassurance, we still preferred to leave. That place was not ours anymore. The officers went to Mark and Julia's house with a search warrant. Once inside, they found the stolen money and proceeded to arrest both of them, while the son was taken to the station to be questioned. The following day, he was declared an accomplice. Later on, Rocky, the Labrador, was entrusted to a family in the neighborhood who took care of him. At that point, we got into the car and left. We moved to a new neighborhood, to a beautiful house. Fortunately, the new neighborhood was made up of good people, and our life went by peacefully. Finally, after so long, we were safe again. I am a 37-year-old woman, and what I'm about to tell you happened about 3 years ago during a stay at an old motel. I was on a business trip, and the next day I was supposed to meet some people for business discussions. It was around 8 p.m., and there were still about 150 miles to go to reach the place where I was supposed to be the next day, so I decided to stop at a motel for the night. The structure was a bit dated, but since I was in a remote area, I couldn't expect anything different. As soon as I arrived at the motel, I went straight to the reception. As I entered, I noticed a man sitting in a chair who stared at me the whole time while I was talking to the receptionist. After a while, the receptionist asked the man if he was waiting for someone since he didn't seem to be a motel guest. The man replied yes. Immediately after, the receptionist asked him if the person he was waiting for was a motel guest. Suddenly, visibly annoyed and without saying a word, the man got up from the chair and left. The receptionist and I looked at each other for a few seconds, incredulous at the strange behavior of that man. Once I was given the room key, I headed towards it. My heart skipped a beat when I saw that man sitting in the chair outside the motel. It seemed like he was waiting for me. So, I hurriedly walked to my room. Suddenly, I started hearing footsteps behind me. I didn't turn to look, but I was almost certain he was following me. I quickly opened the door and entered the room. Shortly after, someone knocked on the door. I looked through the peephole, and when I saw it was that man, my blood froze. I began to wonder what he wanted from me. One thing was certain, he didn't seem to have good intentions. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. In the end, I decided not to open the door and immediately called the reception to report his presence. The receptionist reassured me to stay calm and that he would take care of it. After hanging up, I approached the peephole again to check, but that man was gone. Maybe he had heard my phone call and decided to leave to avoid trouble. Even though that man was no longer outside my door, I couldn't calm down. That situation had shaken me. After a few minutes, someone knocked on my door again. I felt relieved when I saw it was the receptionist. So I opened the door and he told me he had checked around, but there seemed to be no trace of that man. He had disappeared into thin air. Before leaving, he told me that I could call the reception for anything, and he would come immediately to resolve the situation. To release the built-up tension, I decided to take a hot bath. I stayed in my room for about an hour before going out to grab something to eat at a small restaurant I had noticed a couple of miles away. When I left the motel, I looked around to see if that man was somewhere nearby, but fortunately he wasn't there. I headed to the restaurant, had dinner, and then returned to the motel. As soon as I entered, I noticed that the light in my room was on. I thought maybe I had forgotten to turn it off in a hurry before leaving, but it made me somewhat worried. I entered the room, but I felt uneasy. I decided to go out again to go to the reception, where there were some vending machines for drinks. I needed a chamomile tea. After about 20 minutes, I headed back to my room, and as I walked, I heard footsteps behind me again, just like when I had just arrived at the motel. Again, I didn't turn around and briskly walked to my room. Once inside the room, after about 30 seconds, someone started banging loudly on the door. I looked through the peephole, and it was him. I didn't know what to do, whether to call the reception or 911. I was in total panic. I decided to call the reception first, thinking that the receptionist might arrive before the officers since he was closer and could handle the situation more quickly. As soon as the receptionist arrived, that man started running away. I was shocked by what was happening. I couldn't believe it. Fortunately, the receptionist immediately called the police, who arrived on the scene within minutes. After a brief search around the motel, law enforcement managed to locate the man who had hidden on the roof of the building. Shortly after, that man was arrested by the authorities and taken to the police station for questioning. Fortunately, thanks to the prompt action of the receptionist and the timely response of the police, the situation was effectively handled. Although the experience was terrifying, I am grateful for the help I received. Even today, I wonder what would have happened if that man had managed to enter my room. Every time I think back on it, I shudder. I had an old vintage car in my garage, one of those machines that retain the magic of a bygone era. I decided it was time to sell it and opted to post an ad on Craigslist for $7,000. It didn't take long before I received a response, and what struck me was that the person who contacted me was a girl of about 30 years old. It seemed strange to me, as usually that type of car attracted more attention from men. However, I decided not to dwell on it too much and agreed to meet her. The girl suggested meeting the next evening at 9 p.m. in the parking lot of an old abandoned shopping center outside of town. It wasn't a nice place, but the idea of selling the car pushed me to accept. The next evening, at 8:30 p.m., I left home to go to the appointment. When I arrived, though, I realized there was no one there. I waited patiently for about 15 minutes, hoping the girl would arrive. Eventually, I decided to call her, and she answered, saying she was on her way. However, after another 30 minutes of waiting, the girl still hadn't arrived. Feeling sad and disappointed, I returned home thinking it had been a waste of time. But as soon as I got home, the phone rang. It was the girl, apologizing and saying she had had an emergency. She asked if we could meet at 11 p.m. Considering the hour, I was a bit perplexed and asked her if it wouldn't be better to postpone until the next day. She insisted, saying it was important to her, so I agreed. That night, once I arrived at the shopping center parking lot, I noticed there was no one there. I started to fear it was all a prank. I felt disappointed and a bit frustrated for wasting so much time in that situation. But after about 10 minutes, a car entered the parking lot with only one headlight on. Moments later, a girl dressed provocatively got out of the car and approached me. After introducing ourselves, we started discussing the car. The girl asked me why I wanted to sell it, and I explained that I wanted to free up space in my garage and didn't have time for it anymore. She seemed interested and asked for more details about the car and its history. After discussing the details, we came to the crucial point, the price. The girl proposed $6,000, but I was determined not to go below $6,500. After some negotiation, she finally accepted my price, and we agreed to meet the next day at 10 a.m. to finalize the deal and sign all necessary documents. I was happy to have finally found a buyer and gotten rid of the car. My joy suddenly vanished the next morning. As I listened to the day's news, I was shocked to learn that there had been a bank robbery in the city, and that the getaway car's license plate was the same as the one from the car I had sold the day before. I was incredulous and confused. I realized I had done business with a criminal. My mind was in turmoil. I decided it was the right time to go to the police station and provide them with all the information I had to help the officers in the bank robbery investigation. Once at the station, I explained everything in detail to the officers, providing them with every piece of information that could be useful in solving the case. The officers thanked me for my contribution and took note of everything I had to say. From that day on, I decided I would never again use Craigslist or other similar advertising sites. My experience had taught me to be extremely cautious when dealing with strangers on the internet, and that it was always better to be prudent and not at risk getting involved in dangerous or illegal situations. It was a 5-year night, and my girlfriend and I were traveling along a road that seemed to have no end. The car's engine seemed to have some trouble, panting like an exhausted sailor. Our only hope at that moment was to reach a motel to spend the night before the car decided to abandon us for good. Unfortunately, shortly after, the car stopped about a mile from the motel. Fortunately, it decided to leave us at a point where there was enough space to leave it there without obstructing the passage. At that point, we grabbed our suitcases and walked towards the motel. After about 15 minutes, it was there in front of us. The faded neon above the reception emitted a pale glow, creating a rather unsettling atmosphere. We entered the reception and were faced with a tall, slim, and scruffy-looking man with a wrinkled shirt and a bored expression. He looked at us with a kind of indifference before greeting us with an unconvincing tone. "Good evening. What can I do for you?" he asked in a monotone voice like a broken record. We explained our situation and asked for a room for the night. "You're lucky," he said. "It's the only room available. It's the best in the motel. I take special care of it." Great, we thought. A moment later, he handed us the keys and pointed us in the direction of the room. As soon as we entered, we noticed that the room was very dated, bare, and without any charm. The bed seemed to have seen better days, and the bathroom emitted an unpleasant smell. Thank goodness it was the best in the motel, I thought. I dare not imagine the others. We decided not to dwell on it. What mattered to us was to spend the night, fix the car, and continue our journey. We lay down on the bed and started searching the internet for a mechanic in the area who could repair our car, but unfortunately we couldn't find anything suitable. The nearest workshop turned out to be about 50 miles away, which was a decidedly excessive distance for us. We decided that the next day we would ask the motel manager, who surely would know how to help us in some way. At that point, we turned off the lights and tried to sleep, unaware that the night would not be so forgiving. It was about 1 a.m. when I was awakened by a strange sound. I got out of bed trying to figure out what was happening. My girlfriend woke up too, looking at me wide-eyed. From the motel window, we saw a shadow. We couldn't quite make out if it was a man or a woman. With uncertain steps, we approached the window. As we got closer, the outlines became clearer, and we realized it was indeed a man. His figure was tall and slender, wrapped in a dark cloak that fluttered lightly in the wind. The dim light of the neon illuminated the area slightly, but not enough for us to see his face clearly. As we watched that man's appearance, unable to understand what he was doing out there, suddenly his figure approached the glass of our room. Our hearts started beating fast. Fortunately, it was dark in the room, so he couldn't see us, but we could see him, which terrified us. At that point, we didn't know what to do. We decided to call the reception for help. The reception was close to our room, so we could hear the phone ringing. As soon as the phone started ringing, the figure outside our window hurried away, running towards the reception. After a few seconds, someone answered the phone. The realization froze us. We immediately understood that the man outside our window was the hotel manager who had been watching us, and upon hearing the phone ring, he rushed to answer it. We were stuck there, trapped in our room while that man roamed outside the motel with who knows what intentions. We didn't close our eyes all night and waited anxiously for the first light of dawn, praying that moment would come soon and allow us to escape from that cursed place. When the sun finally began to rise, we didn't hesitate for a moment. We gathered our few things, leaving behind every trace of that terrible night, and rushed out of the motel, eager to put as much distance as possible between us and that place. Once at the car, we desperately tried to get it started, but to no avail. Meanwhile, a man with a van, seeing us in trouble, stopped and offered to help. He took us to an old mechanic friend of his, who, although he no longer had the workshop because he was retired, was the only one nearby who could help us. So that man came back with us to the car and fixed it on the spot in about half an hour, finally allowing us to continue our journey. We didn't know how to thank him for his generous gesture that had saved us from that bad situation. So, we finally resumed our journey, trying to forget that horrible night spent at the motel. I hope such a situation never happens again. I am a 20-year-old girl, and last summer I decided to sell my old cell phone online. When I bought it, I paid about $800. Recently, I had purchased a higher model, so I thought of selling the old one to make some extra money. Since the cell phone was about 2 years old, I was sure I could still get a good amount of money for it. I did a quick search on Craigslist for other listings of the same model and listed mine at a slightly lower price than others to sell it as quickly as possible. It was my first time trying to sell something online. I had never bought anything there, but I had a friend who often bought and sold on Craigslist, and recently he told me he had always had a good experience and had always been able to make good deals. After about 2 hours of posting the ad, a man who introduced himself as Edward came forward asking if the cell phone was still for sale. I replied yes, and shortly after he proposed an offer slightly lower than the selling price I had listed. I decided to accept the offer, and we agreed he would come to me the next day, and we would conclude the sale. The next day, a few hours before the appointment, Edward contacted me on WhatsApp asking if I was willing to lower the price further. I told him that the price I had decided to sell it for was already low for the condition the cell phone was in. Edward began to insist to the point where it started to bother me. At that point, I told him I no longer wanted to sell it to him, but he seemed not to care. He kept sending me messages insistently, so I decided to block him on WhatsApp. Shortly after noticing that I had blocked him, he sent me a text message saying he would still come to me. It made me feel uneasy. Why so much insistence? I started to wonder. I replied telling him not to come because I had no intention of selling him the cell phone and that I would sell it to someone willing to pay the price it was worth. He didn't reply to my message. However, at exactly 9:00 p.m., I received a text message from Edward saying, "Open the door, I'm here outside." I didn't know what to do and what to think. I panicked. I decided not to respond to the message. After about a minute, he started calling me. I declined the call and decided to turn off the cellphony. Shortly after, he approached my front door and started knocking loudly. I was petrified. Suddenly, he stopped knocking, so I thought he had gotten tired and would leave. I cautiously looked out the window and noticed he was still there near his car. Shortly after, he started knocking again, making me jump. I decided to send him a warning message telling him that I would call the police if he didn't leave immediately. It seemed to work, but the quiet didn't last long, as after about 10 minutes, he started knocking on the door again. At that point, I decided to call the police. I explained everything that was happening to them, and they told me to stay calm, close the doors and windows, and that officers would arrive soon. After 10 minutes, 3 officers were outside my door. I felt relieved. Unfortunately, Edward managed to escape without leaving any trace. The officers told me to call again if there were any further problems. I couldn't believe that selling a simple cell phone online could turn into a nightmare. I would have never imagined something like this could happen. After about half an hour since the officers had left, I was very tired and decided to go to bed. During the night, around 3:30 a.m., I heard knocking on the door again. It was him. He had returned. I hid under the bed and immediately called the police, who arrived in a few minutes. This time, Edward didn't notice their arrival, and fortunately, the officers managed to arrest him. I have no idea what he had in mind and why he had developed this fixation on me, but he certainly didn't have good intentions. After this disturbing experience, I swore to myself never to use online marketplaces again. It was an experience that has marked me, and I still can't forget it to this day. It was a cold winter evening when my faithful dog Max and I set off to visit some of my relatives who lived outside the city. I remember the snow falling lightly as we made our way along the roads to their house. It was my first time driving in that area, and despite having GPS, I felt a bit disoriented, perhaps due to the unfavorable weather conditions. After a while, I realized we were lost. The road was dark and deserted, and the snow made it difficult to distinguish road signs. Eventually, given the time, I called my relatives, telling them that the snow had made the roads impassable and that I would reach them the next day. At that point, we stopped at a modest motel along the road to spend the night. It was clear from the start that it was not a luxurious place, but we needed rest and warmth. The motel was a low, square building with a barely visible sign. We entered the lobby, and an elderly gentleman greeted us warmly but with a tired smile. The room we were assigned was very simple but had all the essentials. Moreover, the cleanliness was not bad either. During the night, while I was sleeping heavily, I was awakened by a strange noise. I jumped out of bed and realized with horror that Max was no longer beside me. My heart leaped into my throat and I rushed out of the room. At that moment, there was a snowstorm, and fortunately, in the distance, I could see a man dragging Max away. I started running towards the man, screaming. After a brief confrontation, I managed to free Max. I don't know who that man was and why he took my Max, and especially how he managed to enter my room without me noticing. At that point, we returned to the motel room. The cold was unbearable. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I reflected on the incident. I was grateful to have Max back by my side. The next day, we set off again, finally reaching my relatives' house. Their warm welcome put me in a good mood, and finally, I could relax after the nightmare I had experienced. We stayed there for almost a week and then returned home. I don't know what I would have done without my Max if I hadn't been able to save him. Even today, that experience comes back to me. It was terrible. About 2 years ago, I moved to an apartment in the city where, after about a week of being there, strange things began to happen. One night, around 4 a.m., someone knocked on the door. I went to open it, but there was no one there. The first time it happened, I thought it was just an isolated incident, maybe a careless neighbor or a prank by some kid. However, in the following days, the oddities continued. The following nights were even more unsettling. Strange noises coming from the walls, as if someone were pounding on them from the other side. One night, I was certain I heard voices, but when I went out into the hallway to check, everything was silent. There was no one there. Up until that point, I hadn't mentioned it to any of the neighbors, fearing I might seem crazy. Since I was very stressed from work at that time, I began to think maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, and that I needed a vacation. The following nights, it persisted. I remember one particular night where every hour, without fail, the insistent sound of knocking on the door interrupted my sleep. Every time, without exception, when I rushed to open the door, there was never anyone on the other side. It was as if someone were enjoying tormenting me in the dead of night. I couldn't explain it. Was it possible that it was just my mind, or was there something darker behind all of this? Fear began to take over. The situation was becoming a nightmare. After a while, I started hearing noises coming from the neighbor's apartment right next to mine. Strange sounds, as if someone were moving furniture or walking heavily on the floor. At times, it even seemed like I could hear muffled whispers coming from the shared walls. Suddenly, there was another knock on my door. Once again, I rushed to open it, but this time, as soon as I turned the handle, I had a distinct feeling that the neighbor's apartment door slammed shut with a dull thud. At that point, I started to get nervous. Thinking my neighbor was the cause of what I was experiencing, I decided to confront him to clarify once and for all what was happening. With a bit of anxiety, I approached his door and rang the bell. As soon as he opened the door, I told him firmly about the knocking on my door and the noises coming from his apartment. I was surprised when my neighbor began to deny everything. Annoyed by what I had said, he told me that he hadn't knocked on my door or caused those noises and that I had no right to accuse him in that way. That conversation left me with more questions than answers. Who or what was behind all of this? And why did it seem so determined to drive me crazy? As I returned to my apartment, I felt even more confused and worried than before. After about 15 minutes, I began to hear those noises again. I went out the door and knocked on my neighbor's door again, but this time no one answered. I decided it was time to make a drastic decision. The next day, without hesitation, I decided to move out before the situation could have an even greater impact on my mental health. I packed my things quickly and looked for a new place to live peacefully. Although leaving everything behind filled me with sadness, I knew it was the best choice to preserve my mental health and tranquility. I had no intention of being trapped in such a disturbing and inexplicable situation. When I was young, I lived in a rural farmhouse, isolated among the hills of the countryside. My parents were often busy with their affairs, leaving my older brother and me alone for long periods. I still remember the feeling of freedom and responsibility that engulfed us when we began to stay home alone, without visiting grandparents or aunts and uncles. The relationship with my brother wasn't always easy. He was older than me and often had to keep an eye on me, especially because I had a peculiar character. Nevertheless, we spent our afternoons quietly, doing homework, playing games, and enjoying the adventures that only the countryside could offer. One evening, there was a furious storm outside. The rain fell incessantly, accompanied by thunder that made the windows of our old house tremble. It was an unsettling atmosphere, but at the same time, it fascinated us. As I was engrossed in reading a book by the crackling fireplace, the cell phone began to ring. I looked at the display and saw my brother's name, Tim. I raised my eyebrows in confusion, wondering what he wanted. "What's up?" I asked, raising my voice to cover the noise of the storm. No response. With a sigh, I got up from the couch and started climbing the stairs to his room. I reached the door of his room and found it ajar. I pushed the door slightly, but Tim wasn't there. I found his cell phone on the bed, next to a pair of headphones. A moment later, I saw him coming out of the bathroom. I immediately asked him why he had called me, and, confused, he replied that he hadn't. Perplexed, I turned and went back downstairs to read my book. When I reached the ground floor, the blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed by the deafening roar of thunder. The light suddenly went out, leaving me with only the glow of the fireplace illuminating part of the room. Suddenly, the phone rang again, making me jump. It was Tim again. "Hey Tim, what's up? Can you turn the power back on?" I said. No response. Suddenly, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like someone was moving stealthily. Shining the flashlight of my phone, I decided to approach the kitchen door slowly, aware that I would have to face whatever was behind it. As I approached, I caught a glimpse of a shadow through the glass of the door. With terrible anxiety, I opened the door and looking through one of the windows in the kitchen, I realized it was just a tree moving in the storm. I breathed a sigh of relief. Fortunately, a moment later, the power came back on. After a few minutes, my parents returned. We told them everything, and they said we were probably just scared because of the storm. It annoyed me a lot because I was sure of what I was saying. At one point, my father called us angrily. We went to him, and he asked for an explanation of who had scratched the door of his study. We knew nothing about it. That's when things started to take shape. Someone had entered the house. At that point, I began to doubt that the storm had caused the power outage and that someone had deliberately cut off the power. Inside my father's study, 2 computers and a briefcase containing several $1,000s were missing. My father understood the seriousness of the situation and apologized to me and my brother. Shortly after, we also found a broken window at the back of the house. Probably, whoever had entered the house had done so from there. After that incident, we didn't stay home alone for quite some time. It was an unpleasant experience that I still struggle to forget to this day. About 7 years ago, my girlfriend and I decided to take a road trip. The driving hours were many, and dead tired, we decided to look for a place to spend the night. After wandering a bit in search of accommodation, we found a small motel that had only 4 or 5 rooms available. We were so exhausted that we would have accepted anything. Entering the lobby, we were faced with a huge man behind an old counter. After asking him for a room for the night, the man nodded and smiled eerily, revealing a smile with teeth yellowed by cigarette smoke. Immediately after, he began to fill out some forms and took note of our information. That place conveyed a sense of obvious neglect. On the desk were old surveillance monitors and some documents all stained, probably from the drops of whiskey that man was drinking. Once we got the key, we hurried into our room, leaving behind us the unease that man had transmitted to us. The room was modest, with a double bed, an old television, a small table, and a tiny bathroom. It was evident that the place hadn't seen a renovation in years. After washing up, we got into bed trying to find some rest. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up with an urgent need to go to the bathroom and noticed that the lights in the room weren't turning on. I decided to put on some clothes, and despite feeling sleepy, I headed to the reception to report the issue. The lobby was dark and deserted, with only the dim light of an incandescent lamp illuminating the counter. I approached cautiously, calling out softly, "Is anyone there? The lights in the room aren't working. We're in the dark." No one answered. The only thing that could be heard was the background sound of an old radio. I approached the counter more, trying to figure out if there was anyone. By chance, I glanced at the old surveillance monitors. I was petrified. One monitor showed the motel parking lot, another the back of the motel, and another showed our room with my girlfriend sleeping peacefully on the bed. My heart began to beat furiously in my chest as I watched the scene in disbelief. Who was watching those images? And how was it possible that there was a camera in our room without us noticing? I felt a chill at the mere thought that someone had been watching us all that time. I ran to the room, woke up my girlfriend who was still sleepy and didn't understand what was happening. I told her we had to leave quickly and that I would explain everything in the car. We grabbed our suitcases and left that place within minutes. Once we had distanced ourselves enough from the motel, I calmly explained everything I had seen to my girlfriend. My voice trembled slightly as I tried to find the right words to describe the situation. She looked at me with incredulous eyes, unable to believe what I was telling her. Then, suddenly, she burst into tears. I decided to go to the nearest police station and report what had happened. A police officer listened to me carefully and, after taking note of our testimony, informed me that we were not the first to have experienced that situation. The motel owner used to film rooms where there were couples, and if the night took an interesting turn, he would upload the recordings online. The officer explained that several reports had been filed in the past, but so far it had not been possible to incriminate the motel owner. Fortunately, we were okay, although we were still very shaken by the situation. We decided to leave that bad episode behind and continue our journey. Over time, the police finally managed to gather enough evidence to arrest that man and close the motel. After that trip, we learned the importance of being careful about where we stopped during our travels and never taking our safety for granted. I am a 45-year-old doctor with a passion for music. It might seem strange to many, but I collect old vinyl records. This passion of mine began when I was young, discovering the pleasure of listening to albums from my favorite artists on a vintage turntable. Since then, I have always loved the warm and authentic atmosphere that only a vinyl record can offer. My record collection has grown over the years, fueled by my continuous search for rare and valuable albums. Often on weekends, I enjoy exploring flea markets, record stores, and online classifieds, searching for the next gem to add to my collection. One of the most memorable moments of my collecting adventure was when I found an original copy of The Dark Side of the Moon vinyl. For me, it was like finding a piece of musical history frozen in time. I purchased it with a mix of emotion and excitement and proudly added it to my collection. One day, while browsing Craigslist for new additions to my collection, I made a discovery that left me breathless. Among the listings of used items, there was an original copy of the Beatles' Abbey Road vinyl, a limited edition highly sought after by collectors. The price was incredibly low, almost too good to be true. I decided to immediately contact the seller and arranged a meeting for the next day. I could already imagine Abbey Road in my collection. I was thrilled. When I arrived at the designated meeting point, the situation took an unexpected turn. As soon as I arrived at the seller's house, I immediately noticed that the environment was dark and neglected. In short, one of those places where you sense a bad atmosphere as soon as you step in. The facade of the house was dirty and neglected, with weeds growing wildly along the driveway. The air was heavy and oppressive, and a sense of unease enveloped me as I approached the front door. Once I reached the door, I knocked, but no one answered. I tried a second time, and a man opened it. It was him, the man from the listing. He greeted me with a forced smile. As soon as I entered, I noticed that the interior of the house was even worse than the outside. The walls were peeling and dirty, and the furniture looked old and neglected. A feeling of discomfort washed over me as the man led me to the room where he kept the vinyl records. While he quickly showed me his collection, I began to hear screams coming from the basement. They were desperate cries of a woman, full of fear and pain. The voice echoed in the air, creating an even more unsettling atmosphere inside the house. Despite the screams coming from the basement, the seller continued to talk as if nothing was wrong, fervently explaining the details of the vinyl records he had for sale. As he showed me the various album covers and told me the stories behind some albums, the desperate cries continued. Noticing my worried face, the seller said to me, "Don't worry, it's my mother. She has Alzheimer's, it's her illness. Poor thing." "Oh, I'm sorry," I said to him. I asked him how long she had been in that condition, and he replied, "For about a year." The situation seemed strange to me, and I began to suspect something more behind the woman's screams in the basement. I decided to act, and trying to remain calm, I told the seller that I was a doctor and that I understood the difficulties in managing patients with Alzheimer's. I offered him my availability to see his mother and provide him with advice on how to best handle the situation. The seller immediately refused my offer, and I noticed that he became nervous at my offer of help. His reaction further heightened my suspicion, and my concern for that situation grew. I began to seriously think that the seller was hiding something. I didn't say anything else. I took my vinyl records, paid for them, and left. As soon as I left that house, I called the police and reported what had happened and the address of the house, specifying that it was my feeling and that I had no certainty of what I was reporting to them. I couldn't remain inactive in the face of a possible dangerous or abusive situation. The officer I was speaking with told me that they would send a team to the house to investigate. Once the agents arrived at that man's house, the seller refused to let them in without a warrant. The next day, to my surprise, the officers managed to obtain a search warrant for the suspected man's house. They returned to the man's house with the warrant, and once inside, the policemen went down to the basement, following the sound of the cries they had heard before. There they made a shocking discovery. They found a woman tied to a hospital bed. She was clearly in a state of great distress and fear. The officers quickly freed the woman and took her out of the house. After checks, it emerged that the woman was not at all the man's mother, as he had claimed, but a woman who had disappeared 3 years earlier. She was the mother of 3 children and the wife of a man who, after all that time, had never stopped looking for her. For my 16th birthday, I decided to organize a trip with some friends. We were all passionate about movies and often enjoyed imagining ourselves as protagonists in film adventures. What particularly fascinated us were motels, often featured in iconic scenes in movies, so we decided to stay in one to feel like real movie actors. Before going to sleep, we decided to take a walk outside the motel to get some fresh air. Sometimes I suffered from anxiety and needed to take a breath of fresh air. We were on an isolated road with a car passing by occasionally, considering the late hour. Suddenly, a car entered the motel parking lot from which 5 guys got out. They had something in their hands and seemed violent with no good intentions. Given the way they walked, they were definitely drunk or under the influence of some substance. Suddenly, the guys started attacking us for no reason, and one of my friends had his nasal septum broken. After the assault, the guys quickly left. We decided to call the police, who arrived at the scene after a few minutes. They told us that the place was dangerous and that we shouldn't have gone out alone at that time. We told them that we were unfamiliar with the area and therefore unaware of the danger. Shortly after, the officers accompanied my friend to the hospital for his broken nose. He was treated and returned to the motel after about 2 hours. At that point, we locked ourselves in the room and didn't go out anymore. The lesson was enough for us. The next day, my friend still had pain in his nose, so we preferred to go back home instead of continuing the trip. What was supposed to be an unforgettable experience turned into a real nightmare. Certainly, next time we will inform ourselves better about the areas and take greater precautions. It was an experience to forget. Many years ago, I worked at a local cafe that was a gathering spot for young people. It was a lively place and stayed open late into the night, attracting a clientele ranging from 18 to 30 years old. During those times, the cafe's opening hours were quite extensive, from the early hours of the morning until around 5 a.m. Being a night barista was no walk in the park. Working late meant dealing with particular people, often those who had had a few too many drinks. It was a challenging task. The boss always told me never to keep more than $150 in the cash register during the night shift. The environment wasn't safe, especially considering that the cafe was located in a not-so-peaceful area of the city. I had to be always alert and prepared to deal with unexpected situations. During the night shift, there was always a guy named Jake with me, with whom a beautiful friendship had blossomed. His presence made me feel safer and more at ease. Jake was tall and sturdy with a friendly smile that immediately put people at ease. He had a relaxed way of handling situations and knew how to stay calm even in the tensest moments. His company gave me a sense of protection and allowed me to face the night work with greater serenity. He was a true ally during those long nights at the cafe. Unfortunately, one evening Jake wasn't at work because he had a commitment. I was nearing the end of my shift. It was around 4:30 in the morning, and I was about to close the place. Suddenly, 2 men entered and asked for a drink. I tried to explain to them politely that we were closed, but they seemed unwilling to understand. They started making unpleasant remarks about my body, and one of them even dared to caress my face. It was clear that they had already had a few too many drinks. I was panicking, but trying not to show it, as I figured out a way to get them to leave without worsening the situation further. Suddenly, the one who had touched my face jumped behind the counter, asking me if life in there bored me and if I wanted to have some fun. I firmly replied that I was fine, that I didn't find working there boring at all, and that they needed to leave because my boss was about to arrive. My voice was trembling, but I tried to maintain a firm and confident tone, trying not to let the fear show. He began to approach closer and closer, and the situation was about to take a turn for the worse. Fortunately, 6 guys entered, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, they immediately understood the situation and intervened, telling them to leave. Strangely, the 2 men had no reaction, perhaps because they realized they were outnumbered by the guys confronting them. They turned around and left the premises without saying a word. As soon as they left, I breathed a sigh of relief, finally feeling safe. I couldn't stop thanking the guys who had saved me. Shortly after, Jake arrived and immediately sensed that something was wrong. I approached him and quickly told him what had happened. From that night on, Jake never missed a shift at work. His presence continued to give me security and tranquility, and together we faced the long nights at the cafe. That bad experience had taught me that, even in difficult situations, there is always someone willing to help and protect others. As for the cafe, we had security cameras installed to make it a safer environment. Six months ago, my best friend and I made a bold decision to embark on a round-the-world trip. Even today, we are still on the journey, and I am writing these lines from our hotel room here in Paris. Finally, we managed to fulfill our dream of working online and exploring the world. What I'm about to tell you is an experience that happened to us 3 months ago, and I hope it never happens again in my entire life. We were in Texas, for privacy reasons. I won't disclose the exact location. After months of planning and saving, we had abandoned the restrictions of a traditional job to embrace the freedom of being masters of our own time and destinations. One evening, exhausted from the long journey, we decided to stop at a motel along the road. It was a building that seemed to have seen better days. The facade was peeling, and the windows were dirty, but we didn't care. We just needed to recharge our energies to continue the next day. The room, though humble, offered a cozy refuge from the fatigue of travel. After getting ready for bed, we lay down, and after planning the next day, fell asleep. About 2 hours after we had fallen asleep, around 3 a.m., our rest was interrupted by screams and sirens. We woke up abruptly, confused and disoriented, surrounded by smoke and flames. Panic gripped us. Without wasting time, we rushed towards the exit. Outside, all the motel guests had come out of their rooms, agitated as much as we were. After a few minutes, fortunately, the rescue teams arrived and managed to extinguish the flames. Shortly after, the police arrived, who, after conducting preliminary investigations, concluded that it was an arson attack. They asked the motel owner if he had recently had any disputes with anyone, and if he had enemies who could have caused all this. He replied that although he had had some problems in the past, it had happened several years ago. However, the possibility that someone wanted to settle scores, despite the time that had passed, was not ruled out. After the police finished their investigations, they asked us if we had noticed anything suspicious during our stay at the motel. We told them that we were only there for one night, and that we hadn't noticed anything strange until just before going to bed. After about 2 weeks, the truth about who caused the fire finally emerged. It was a group of former employees of the motel who had had problems with the owner in the past. It was discovered that the motel owner had refused to pay their salaries for several months. Enraged by the injustice they had suffered and eager for revenge, these former employees had planned and carried out the fire to settle the scores. The fact is, their action that night endangered the lives of many innocent people. In the end, the members of the group responsible for the fire were arrested and brought to trial. After the incident, we decided to leave Texas and continue our journey to new destinations. We were lucky to have woken up in time and managed to get out before the fire spread further. The mere thought of what could have happened still sends shivers down our spines today. My name is Sarah. I'm a 43-year-old woman, and even today I find it hard to believe what happened to me. Last month I was traveling to Las Vegas and decided to stay at a modest motel along the way. It seemed like a quiet and safe place. It was around 4:15 in the morning and I was sleeping in my room when suddenly the phone in my room rang. Who could it be at this hour? I thought. Given the time, I assumed it was the guy at the front desk who had to communicate something important to me, but it wasn't. I answered, and there was a male voice on the other end saying, "Hi, are you Sarah?" "Yes," I replied. The voice on the other end started saying, "Sarah, Sarah, 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 what a beautiful name." I felt a shiver down my spine. He said it in a tone I didn't like at all. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to stay calm. He told me he was an old high school friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. I didn't know what to think. I was confused. Reflecting on it, I remembered some of my former classmates with whom I had recently reconnected on social media. It could be one of them, I thought, but I couldn't explain how he knew I was there in that remote motel. I continued the conversation with that man for a few minutes, trying to get as much information as possible and understand who he was. I asked for his name and which school we had attended together. He replied with a smile that his name was John, and I was amazed when he said the exact name of the school. At some point, I asked him, "How did you know I'm here in this motel?" The answer was a long silence followed by a sigh. Something was wrong. It was as if someone was playing with me, but I didn't understand what his intent was. I decided to end the call, saying that I was tired and needed to sleep. The man didn't seem upset and bid me farewell with a slightly sinister voice. "See you soon, Sarah." That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was filled with anxiety and unanswered questions. Who was that man really? How did he find me? What did he want from me? After a few hours, the sun rose. I prepared to leave the room to go to the front desk, but I was scared at the thought that that man might be out there somewhere. Fortunately, in the distance, I saw a woman coming out of her room and I approached her so as not to be alone. As soon as I arrived at the front desk, I approached the motel manager and began to tell with trembling voice what had happened to me. I described the unusual phone call I received and my fear of being targeted by someone unsavory. The woman, who had just come out of the room with a worried look, listened carefully as I spoke. The receptionist, while I was telling him what happened, maintained a neutral expression the whole time. After finishing telling what happened, the woman hesitated for a moment before speaking. Then, with a tense voice, she said she had experienced a similar situation. She, too, had received a strange phone call from a man with a disturbing tone who had asked her inappropriate questions and knew many things about her. After listening to her words, I felt even more scared and vulnerable. It was evident that we were both facing the same situation. We looked at each other with worried looks, wondering who that man could be. At that point, feeling in danger and not knowing what to do, we decided to immediately call the police and explain the situation to them. A few minutes later, the officers arrived at the motel. With professionalism and determination, the officers listened carefully to our testimonies, noting every detail. They tried to reassure us, guaranteeing that they would do everything possible to resolve the situation and ensure our safety. The officers immediately began to investigate, trying to trace the origin of the phone calls. After about 15 minutes, they discovered that the calls had been made from a payphone about 5 miles from the motel. This meant that the man at the time of the call was in the area, which further increased our concern. Despite the difficulties in tracking down the individual, the officers worked tirelessly to identify that man. Knowing that the police were doing everything possible made us feel safer. Shortly after, both I and that woman left the motel. We exchanged phone numbers to occasionally hear from each other to support each other. It was important for both of us to have someone to share our concerns with and update each other on the situation, especially if that man tried to contact us again.